1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're live, coming to you from across the divided states of America, the most politically disruptive show in those states. In the independent corner, I am investigative political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And as we often do, we get into the headlines first thing this morning. We repeat these at 8 and 9 a.m. In about 15 minutes, by the way, we're going into Jamarl's monologue, so stay tuned for that. But first, in the news. Talking over each other and dodging questions, Vice President Pence and Senator Kamala Harris clashed in their only debate this electoral season. Pence defended the White House's decision to not require masks at events, saying that he and President Trump, quote, trust the American people to make choices in the best interests of their health, end quote. This follows Trump's hospitalization over the weekend due to his contraction of COVID-19. Kamala pushed back, saying that Trump couldn't be trusted to respond accurately to the pandemic, quote, let's talk about trusting the American people. You respect the American people when you tell them the truth. End quote. The debate was held on either side of a plexiglass divide added for the protection of the candidates after the aforementioned contraction of COVID-19 by Trump, and by the way, by many of his associated White House officials and politicians. But what I see most people talking about on social media and in the press is the fly that landed on Pence's head and sat there for a solid 2 minutes. So that would include Joe Biden, who during the debate solicited donations in a tweet that read, quote, pitch in $5 to help this campaign fly, end quote. Following Trump's request, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, on Tuesday declassified documents that revealed former CIA Director John Brennan briefed former President Obama on Hillary Clinton's purported plan to tie then-candidate Donald Trump to Russia as, quote, a means of distracting the public from her use of a private email server, end quote, ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Included in the documents that Ratcliffe released Tuesday were handwritten notes from 2016 by then CIA Director John Brennan after he briefed then President Barack Obama on a U.S. intelligence assessment of narratives that Russian security services were pushing at the time. I'm going to quote from this. Quote, we're getting additional insight into Russian activities from redacted. He also mentioned that, end quote there, he also mentions a plan from one of Hillary Clinton's advisors, I quote again here, a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service, end quote. The notes also included a one-line comment which reads like this, quote, any evidence of collaboration between Trump campaign plus Russia, end quote. Trump's tweet announcing the release reads, quote, I have fully authorized the total declassification of any and all documents pertaining to the single greatest political crime in American history, the Russia hose. Likewise, the Hillary Clinton email scandal. No redactions, exclamation point, end quote. By the way, we will be talking about this both in this upcoming segment, I believe, with Alexander Mercouris at 7:30, as well as with Lee Stranahan at 8:30. Our next headline, the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow counting for the 2020 census to end soon. This comes in an emergency request on Wednesday from Acting Solicitor General Jeffrey Wall. In that request, Wall said that the Census Bureau must immediately wrap up its field operations now that it's passed the Bureau's internal target date of October 5th in order to have a chance of meeting the legal deadline for delivering the first set of census results to President Trump by year's end. The administration's move comes hours after a federal appeals court rejected its earlier attempt to block a lower court that extended the counting timeline for the 2020 census in order to give the Bureau more time to get an accurate count. For now, the judges ruled the tallying of the country's residents must keep going through October 31st.
Shane,
Turkey's parliament.
Real quick, Shane, isn't it strange how the indispensable nation, the greatest democracy on the planet, the shining city on the hill where every other graveling country just wants at some point in 1,000 years to be like, that we screw around with voting and census and these type of things like that for political aim? Like, honestly, let people vote.
Yeah, yes. And part of this is just, it seems like the various parts of our system are in shambles. It's not just the political side of it. It's also, the coronavirus hit that slowed things down. This is actually we were talking yesterday about the USPS. I mentioned infrastructure, after our conversation with Chuck Slatkin. You're talking about the USPS and how it rivals, it's paramount in importance to the physical infrastructure that we use.
Yeah.
This is another side of that. This is like a structural component of our society. When you can't get a census, when you can't get an accurate read on how many people are where, you're basically failing to fulfill one of the basic obligations that I think the state holds there, which is just to have a sense of where the country's at in these different ways.
Oh,
so it really is
agree.
that deep. That's my point.
In fact, I think it goes further. I mean, if we're talking about ways of, let's say, maintaining the land or maintaining an idea of what our world is doing so we can make adjustments for that world. Let's say if we had keeping track of crops or keeping track of soil yields and those type of things. We can't even do that. I mean, this is basic of just counting a person. But for us to have some level of control over our world and to be able to supply resources to everybody around the planet, we need to know what our world can do. And if we can't even do the basic things of counting people, God. And it's not that we can't do it, it's that it's politically inopportune to do so for some. It's just, it just sucks. That's all. I try to point out what's rational versus what's not. And this is one of those things where it's rational to some to screw with this. It's not rational to the rest of us.
I hear you. All right, and our next headline. France, the U.S., and Russia are holding talks in Geneva today to discuss the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. This comes as fears of a regional war grow. 3 countries are members of the OSCE Minsk group. That's the diplomatic organization responsible for mediating the conflict between the 2 countries. French Minister of Foreign Affairs Jean-Yves Le Drian said Russian, French, and U.S. representatives would also meet in Moscow on Monday to look at ways to persuade the warring sides to negotiate a ceasefire. The Armenian foreign minister said Foreign Minister Zorab Natskanyan would visit Moscow on Monday, but gave no details. It ruled out a meeting with Azerbaijan's prime minister. Azerbaijan's foreign minister, by the way, said Wednesday he will be visiting Switzerland for the talks taking place there today. This comes as Azerbaijani and ethnic Armenian forces fought new clashes in and around the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Azerbaijan said the city of Ganja was shelled by Armenian forces and that 1 civilian had been killed in the Goranboy region. It said other villages were fired on by ethnic Armenian forces. The defense minister of the breakaway Nagorno-Karabakh region, meanwhile, run by ethnic Armenians, said it had recorded another 30 casualties among its troops, pushing the military death toll there to 350 since fighting with Azeri forces erupted on September 27th. The fighting has surged to its worst level since the 1990s, when some 30,000 people were killed. I just want to do a brief call out. I thought we had a great segment on this yesterday when we were talking with Daniel Lazar. Good, we talked about a bunch of other stuff too, but I think a solid segment there. One of the things that he pointed out, I'm not including in this headline, is the massive displacement in Nagorno-Karabakh. He gave a figure, about 50% of people in that region have been displaced from their homes, as they would be if there's, active military conflict ongoing with rockets being fired from either side of this line. Anyway, as we've talked about before, that's not a good situation. It's a frozen conflict that's suddenly become very quickly unfrozen. The worries about a regional war seem justified. And then, of course, there's also the worry that Turkey, which heavily involved in Azerbaijan at this point, supporting Azerbaijan. Turkey, a member of NATO, could draw NATO, the rest of NATO, into a conflict with Russia, being one of the chief mediators here. So thankfully, it seems like the U.S. is not pushing for that for now. I saw U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien making comments about how the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh is actually one of the domains in which Russia and the U.S. agree. So hopefully that tenor continues. That's certainly the hope on our end. This also, I would just tie another story into this. Turkey's parliament has ratified a motion to continue cross-border military operations in Iraq and Syria. They extended a motion to allow that governmental authority to launch cross-border military operations for one more year. The motion had previously allowed the Turkish armed forces to carry out cross-border operations from October 30th, 2018 until October 30th, 2019. All political parties in the country, except for the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, supported that motion. That motion, by the way, came ahead of Turkey's planned military operation in the east of the Euphrates in northern Syria. Next headline here. The World Bank has said that largely due to the coronavirus, up to 150 million people could slip into extreme poverty around the world, living on less than $1.90 a day, US dollars there, by late next year, depending on how badly economies shrink during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some 82% of the people entering extreme poverty are expected to be in middle-income countries such as India, Nigeria, and Indonesia. Many will be more educated urban residents, meaning that cities will see an increase in the kind of poverty traditionally rooted in rural areas. The coronavirus crisis is expected to drive a 3.3% contraction in sub-Saharan African economies in 2020 and could push 40 million people into extreme poverty. The Washington-based lender said growth in the region, that's sub-Saharan Africa, would recover in 2021 with economies growing by 2.1%. That's below 2019's growth of 2.4%. The bank said that the pandemic has put, quote, a decade of hard-won economic progress at risk, end quote. One thing that I want to point out here, Jamarl, real quick, I'm just going to read this briefly again. Some 82% of the people entering extreme poverty are expected to be in middle-income countries. Many will be more educated urban residents. I'm going to end the quote there. That makes me worry about a lot of civil unrest, because usually if you have the very, very poor suddenly pushed into even greater depths of poverty, well, that's a horrible situation from a humanitarian perspective. That's not the kind of situation that usually leads to like a successful overthrow of a government. But if you have a bunch of middle income people who suddenly lose that income and they're educated, they're on social media, they're sort of culturally in touch in some sense, and they have power, but they've lost it. That's the situation where you get some potential for serious civil unrest, the toppling of governments, that kind of thing. So with 150 million people potentially slipping into those levels of poverty, including a lot of them in cities, it's not going to be a good situation. What's your take, Jamarl?
Yeah, that's going to be chaos. I mean, so a few parts of that is funny. You're right that everyone down the income ladder is bribed to accept basically a system, to not overthrow that system. Meaning, all right, this is enough for me, even though there are problems, even though I don't particularly like this, that, and all of this other stuff. We don't have enough people to overthrow it. I don't necessarily. So, and it's too much energy to do it. And I do have a dog, I do have a cat, I do have a house. Life's not perfect. But the further you get down, that gets worse. Now the catch becomes the people, like you said, the bottom end of that don't have the power in and of themselves to turn it down. I mean, at the end of the day, you have cops who would come and shoot those poor people in the face for trying to make any kind of appropriation or any kind of, let's say, belligerent statement in regards to dictating how unfair the system is. But the moment you get middle income, then your problem becomes a little bit more in depth, right? I mean, you have people who expect a certain way of life and get very angry when that way of life is not there. And that expectation in and of itself, meaning anger. You know, what is it to work $15 or $20 an hour? Your job gets shipped overseas because a corporation can make an extra buck on it, and you're working at Walmart making minimum wage or like $10. Is that rage? How do you take care of your family? How do you take care of yourself? What does it look like for the contraction in your life? And do you have a right to be pissed off? And so, yeah, I agree with you, Shane. Yeah, 1,000%. Yeah. That's the point where I think things get dicey, to put it mildly.
Absolutely. All right, two more headlines. I want to go through these real quick. In Brazil, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro says he has ended the country's biggest ever corruption probe. That's Operation Car Wash, as there is, quote, no more corruption in the government, end quote. That's a rhetorical overstatement, I think, but that probably doesn't need underlining for practically anybody listening. Launched 6 years ago, the investigation put some of the biggest names in Brazilian politics and business behind bars. That includes left-wing former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who accused the judiciary of, quote, working to criminalize the left, end quote, after the Supreme Court ordered his release last November. Operation Car Wash was extended by Brazil's Attorney General until January 31st of the upcoming year, upended Brazilian politics and business since it was launched as a money laundering probe. Using an aggressive strategy of arrests and plea bargains, it exposed a massive corruption scheme in which politicians and business executives plundered billions of dollars from state-run oil company Petrobras. Recently, critics have accused the task force of pushing its aggressive tactics too far, provoking twin political and economic crises and undermining suspects' right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. It also faces accusations of playing politics, particularly after leaked communications appeared to show investigators conspiring to keep Lula, a left-wing icon, from staging a comeback in Brazil's 2018 presidential race. Lula, who was the most popular candidate, was barred from contesting the elections that Bolsonaro won. I would love to get somebody on to talk about this soon. Quick note there. But going into my last headline, Hurricane Delta is headed for the Gulf Coast. It's strengthened back into a Category 2 as it heads for a Friday landfall on the Gulf Coast with storm surge flooding, damaging winds, and rainfall flooding due from Louisiana and East Texas to Mississippi. A hurricane warning is in effect there from east of Sabine Pass, Texas to Morgan City, Louisiana. That includes Lake Charles and Lafayette in Louisiana. This means hurricane conditions are expected there within 36 hours. And with that, you've listened to our headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going to go into a break. We'll be back on the other side with Jamarl Thomas giving us his take. Until then, know you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
We are talking.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you are consuming this content, definitely give us a like and a share. Your likes and shares helps us become more visible. Also, it gives us an idea of what you guys like and dislike. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you could send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. If it is an issue of an opinion, if it's an issue of a disagreement, if any of those things, feel free to call in. Your engagement makes the show important. Don't be shy, and don't just be a troll in the margins. So I was honestly going to do this monologue as I sat here this morning and scribbling my notes and everything else from last night on the vice presidential debate. That was going to be it. I was going to point to how hard right-wing that debate was, how the murder of Soleimani wasn't the issue that they murdered somebody in somebody else's territory without really just cause. No, it was more so that there was a response that injured our soldiers. When you get a right-wing, hardcore vice president that is able to turn to the Democrat and say, you kept people in prison for blacks. You kept blacks. The same community that you are using as a prop to do gymnastics on to get into the White House with the best chance that a vice presidential candidate has ever in the history of the world of being president in Biden's administration. As you use blacks for props, and as Biden uses blacks for props while you were in office, you kept them in prison or sentences 19 times longer. That's embarrassing. He could have went to keeping a man on death row. He could have went to locking up stoners and laughing about it. He could have went to attacking a homeless mother on a truancy violation, threatening to put her in prison or threatening to put her in jail, as if the issue is not the homelessness. But no, her kids can't get to school. I'm telling you, the issue was a homelessness. There's all sorts of things you could have hit Kamala Harris on. He just chose a few. Yeah, it was an unforgettable, massively unwatchable Democratic debate. Debate from the standpoint of our presidency. But the wild part is on that it had to be watched because you have, as somebody I think pointed out yesterday, the chance of Kamala Harris becoming president. A real, clear, legitimate chance. You don't have to look at Joe Biden. Just look. You don't have to say anything. Just observe. Is that the same man that was there 4 years ago? And that answer, if you're being bluntly honest with yourself, is no. Even in the way Joe Biden talks about it, I need somebody ready on day one. Why, Joe? Why do you need somebody ready on day one? Just because. I'm just making a point that, yes, it was unwatchable. Yes, nothing that you're getting out of that is really of substance in real terms in regards to what and how we operate. By the same token, to some degree, it's almost necessary to watch, as necessary as a presidential debate, because she could be your president in real terms, even in the first year. Just pointing that out. More importantly, and the thing I wanted to get to, though, was this quote by the releasing of the documents. John Ratcliffe, D&I director, releases documents basically showing the conversation that Shane mentioned in the headlines. We're getting John Brennan. We're getting additional insight into Russian activities from Redacted. Brennan notes reads, included a plan from one of Hillary Clinton's advisors, a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by Russian security service. The notes also included a one-line comment which reads, any evidence of collaboration between Trump campaign and Russia. Trump immediately, full-throated, tweets, I have authorized the total declassification of any and all documents pertaining to the single greatest political crime in American history, the Russian hoax. Likewise, the Hillary Clinton email scandal, no redactions. Now, my heart leapt. Trump had been bashing people left and right all day, belligerent, just unhinged and deranged. And yet, on this, applause. The American public should see it. Why shouldn't the American public see it? It should be open. If you're going to say that the President of the United States did something, then show it. Show it. Give us your evidence. Give us your information. Give us your thought process. Give us the means to which you were doing this to rapture this country into conspiracy theory for 3 years. Understand, 3 years. All other business, for the most part, was put to the side without, meaning this country could have had a relationship, less hostilities with Russia. And instead, for political reasons, the Democratic Party chose to turn this into an attack piece, into a weapon, and to basically weaponize this against the president under the idea and hope of a soft coup and delegitimizing that president at the same time. Now, my heart doesn't bleed too much for this because Trump tried to do the same thing with the birth certificate stuff, so good for the goose, good for the gander. But the issue here more so is that the hostilities between the two countries and what it's going to look like if Biden gets in. Meaning Democrat and all of these other Democrats in hysterics. One thing I want to put out, and I'm going to end it here. The response from John Brennan. John Ratcliffe is anything but an intelligence professional. It is appalling. His selective declassification of information. It is designed to advance the political interests of Donald Trump and Republicans who would line with him, Brennan said of the Director of National Intelligence. A selective declassification of information for political reasons. I'm astounded by the level of hypocrisy here. Keep in mind, this is exactly what they did to Trump. Leaks, one after the next. People screaming, Trump is working with Russia, Trump is doing this, Trump is doing that. And then as the investigation takes place, they all fall apart. Selective. Pull information from a Brit. That Brit supposedly gets information from Russia, and they shop it around to try to give it to people in the political space. It was known to be a farce. And yet, this is what we ended up with for 3 years. Applause to Trump for this. Shane, I don't think you're going to have any disagreements in regards to Trump releasing this, and we're going to get further into it later on. But what do you think about it? I love this. My heart leapt 4 spots on this.
He'd done it sooner. That's the only thing. He should have done it sooner. I worry that this is going to get completely drowned out right now. And, we'll see how the media starts to receive it. I'm guessing they're not going to receive it that well, if at all, for the most part. If and when they do, it'll be buried. This is a big story. It has been for years. The fact that it was used as a weight to try to drag Trump down, and that apparently a lot of it is false. Those who've been listening to the show for a while, back to the previous holders of it, a lot of this is fake, a lot of this is false, and it's been used not just to demonize Trump, but frankly to demonize Russia, and that's the scariest part of it to me, because we're 2 nuclear powers who are fighting over a made-up story here that was just used for domestic, not just used, but it was in large part used just for a domestic political contest. So the fact that the stakes are so high, and yet the commitment or I guess my point here is we should have a better perspective on these things than to for self-serving short-term political interests, take actions that could imperil the entire world. That's my final take, but we'll be going into this in more depth with Alexander Mercouris, and also we'll be talking about it again at 8:30 with Lee Stranahan too, talking about Ukraine, including the recently announced investigation of Joe Biden, which that could become big news depending on how well and how quickly that goes in the next month. But we're leading up to an election. There are going to be echoes of people accusing Trump of trying to drag down Hillary. It's just things on both sides. Anyway, I kind of have a mixed bag of takes. But
yeah, that's
what's your response to Jamarl?
He should have did it sooner. I wondered why. At the time when this came out, I kept thinking to myself, well, why now? Like, is it the drugs? Is it the steroids? Like I said, Trump was belligerent in the White House the other day. He was sending Twitter storms left and right, belligerence. He was screaming at Barr, talking about do something, arrest somebody already, that type of stuff. And so I don't know. Like I said, I think a thin-skinned man got embarrassed. And that's thin-skinned man who got extremely embarrassed in front of 300, or you might as well say the world, after he caught COVID, who looked weak, going to the hospital, is now raging out. I think all of this is a response to that. And even to, honestly, pressure. He just lost a court case yesterday. You have another situation where, he may lose this election. In fact, it looks like he's going to lose this election. Who knows? Anything could happen. But so, this is probably pressure bust pipes, like we used to say at the barbershop. And this might be a case of that. Pressure, bursting pipes, where he is just putting it all out. Now, and he, like you said, why? Let me ask you this. Why don't you think he did this sooner? What do you think his reasons were for holding it to this point? Or do you think it's not reasons? It's just feeling?
I can only speculate, and so I'm going to spend about only 10 seconds doing that. But my guess is that there were internal congressional politics that kept this information from coming out. I don't think it was on Trump's end. If he had been able to do this, I think he would have done it. I think it was on other parties' ends. That's my guess there. What's yours, Jamarl?
Interesting. I don't know. My first thought is, at the point where the Russiagate stuff started, he has no power to do it. None. Because if you remember, he's coddled. He was boxed in that office. And so anything that he did was put through the lens of Trump and Russia. So if Trump takes a action like that, where he says, all right, I'm going to release these files, you would have had people screaming at the height of their lungs. And he was susceptible to that at that early time, especially when they were trying to get impeachment hearings. If they found anything at all, when Mueller was doing his investigation, anything Trump did, they would say something like, well, Mueller may take action against Trump for threatening so-and-so. And he's saying something on Twitter about somebody else. And it's he may take action. So his actions, to some degree, I think, were boxed in. He thought he might have been politically boxed in from doing something. Now, no.
Essentially.
Yeah. That's my take.
One thing I'm really curious about here. I'm really curious about who that foreign policy advisor is. I'm gonna again read the quote here from the Brennan notes that were declassified here. A proposal from one of her, he's referencing a plan that he's talking about here, a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors, that's Hillary Clinton, one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service, end quote. Now, I'm guessing, and I want to ask Lee about this later just because this is his bailiwick. I am guessing that is Strobe Talbot. That is a guess, but that's an educated guess. Strobe Talbot worked with Cody Shearer to create the predecessor to the Steele dossier, which you were talking about earlier. And Cody Shearer and Strobe Talbot, decades-long ties to the Clintons. And Strobe Talbot is the operative who, along with Cody Shearer, would have done this stuff. So there are a lot of connections here. There's also Brett Kimberlin, which we've never talked about, convicted serial bomber Brett Kimberlin, who is working with Alexandra Chalupa and has connections to Cody Shearer going back decades. Alexandra Chalupa, Ukrainian American, who is working with the DNC, with the Ukrainian embassy to dig up dirt on Paul Manafort. I mean, this stuff back in 2016, a lot of this fallen out of the news cycle a little bit. There was this confluence of events that we're still unpacking and trying to unravel. Yeah. And my only hope is that we can actually unravel them, that this doesn't get drowned out by the election. But with that, we've got to go into a break. We will be back on the other side of this break, continuing this conversation with Alexander Mercouris. Until then, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for these next two segments, Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You should check them out. Go read their stuff, theduran.com. Alexander, thank you for joining us. How are you this morning?
I'm very well, and a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you with us, and especially under such auspicious circumstances, by which I mean the release of these files. I know that you've been following this for years, and I wanted to get your take. Really glad you could join us. I think we should maybe just start there and then go into Nagorno-Karabakh in the next segment, assuming we get around to it, which hopefully we will. Trump called for the release of Russiagate docs. Ratcliffe provided. This came out on Tuesday, and the redacted docs that he was releasing here highlight a plot from Hillary Clinton, coming from a foreign policy advisor of Hillary Clinton, specifically to basically discredit, push down, vilify Donald Trump. I'm going to quote here, by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service. Quote, end quote. Alexander, what's your take? What's your take on the release of these documents?
I think this is an extraordinarily interesting development because, bear in mind, the US intelligence community clearly gave credence to this information because Brennan, who was the CIA director, took it seriously enough to brief Obama about it. Obama, of course, being the president of the United States. So we now have a situation where the whole Russiagate conspiracy theory, which I should stress has been completely discredited, has been attributed to a decision made by Hillary Clinton herself. Now, it seems that decision was made on the 26th of July, 2016. In other words, during the election. It was proposed to her by one of her foreign policy advisors. We don't know which. The Russians got wind of it in some form. We don't know how. The US intelligence community got wind of the fact that the Russians had found out about it. Again, we don't know how. But 26th of July 2016 is an extraordinarily interesting and important date because we had just 2 days before one of Mrs. Clinton's advisors, Mr. Mook, coming and saying that the Russians had in some way been involved in the hacking of the DNC computers and the stealing of the DNC's emails. There's then a discussion, obviously. Hillary Clinton makes the decision to allege that Trump was some way involved with that on the 26th of July. That's just 2 days later. And on the 31st of July 2016, that's just 5 days after that decision, the FBI opens Crossfire Hurricane, the investigation of the Russiagate conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton and her team were floating and which they concocted and agreed to float at this meeting on the 26th of July, apparently. So there are still lots of missing pieces. We know that Brennan obviously took this seriously, sufficiently seriously to brief Obama about it. We're not yet sure what exactly happened as a result of that briefing. We don't even know who was present at that briefing, though it seems possible that Susan Rice and James Comey attended, but we don't know for that. We don't know that for certain. We don't even know the exact date when this briefing took place, because the briefing, the date of the briefing has not been disclosed, and Brennan's written notes of the briefing have been very heavily redacted. But it seems to me extraordinary stuff, explosive material, and one would love to see more. And I do hope that Trump this time does get his way, and that more information that has been redacted is unredacted, and the classification process is reversed.
I completely agree with you, Alexander. Like I said, my heart leapt. I saw this last night. I did the video last night, and just making a very basic point that this hysteria that has raptured the United States for 3 years. And look, if you don't live here, you won't necessarily get it. But the people who live here and who live under it and who are not Democrats or who are not part of this hysteria get it. For something that severe to go on for 3 years that could literally depose a sitting president of the United States, duly elected, whatever you want to think about it. Yeah, all of the information should come out. The American public should know. And so, this is one of those things, like Shane said, Trump should have did it earlier. Let me ask you this. Why don't you think he did that earlier? Meaning, my suspicion is like politics, but what's yours? What's the rationale for it?
Well, it seems that Trump did try to get a mass declassification of documents underway last year. I mean, I remember he basically tweeted that he was going to do it. And then there was enormous pushback from the bureaucracy. It seems that Chris Wray at the FBI and Gina Haspel at the CIA and Dan Coates, who was at that time Director of National Intelligence and who's known now to have been very hostile to Trump, all pushed back very aggressively. And that decision simply didn't really gel. Nothing actually happened as a result of it. So this information has been pried out of the bureaucracy, one document at a time, each of these documents incredibly heavily redacted. And I think you're quite right, by the way. I think Trump himself wasn't pushing aggressively for this last year or up to very recently, because I think he calculated that for political reasons, if he went ahead and started declassifying documents and insisting that the documents be published unredacted, there would be a massive political storm. It might reignite the impeachment issue, which was then very live. And the result is it's all now been left to a few weeks before the presidential election, when it may very well turn out to be too late, because that's the problem with leaving things as late as this. But we will see what comes of this. I mean, we desperately need to see these documents. The worry must be that we won't if Trump loses. I know there are lots and lots of people who yearn to see Trump out of the White House. I understand why, but one has to also understand that exactly as you said, an attempt to remove a sitting president from office by running with a theory which was clearly fabricated by his political opponents, as the intelligence community obviously knew, is an extremely serious matter. And if it was done to this president, it could potentially be done in the same way to any other president who seeks to pursue policies that the permanent national security bureaucracy of the United States does not like. So this is an existential issue, in my opinion, and you need to put your feelings about Donald Trump to one side in order to grasp the importance of this.
I can't help but agree this is an existential issue. I'm actually going to take that same take in a slightly different direction. This is being called Russian disinformation. In advance of its release, a number of people on the left and in the establishment, including Nick Merrill, Clinton's spokesperson, they called the allegations baseless. They've said that what's being released here effectively is Russian disinformation. I'm going to quote from Ratcliffe here. To be clear, this is not Russian disinformation and has not been assessed as such by the intelligence community. End quote.
And just to point out, wait, Shane, also, this was in Brennan's handwriting. Sure. This was his handwriting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I don't know how exactly. You'd have to go to some lengths to label that disinformation. But here's where I wanted to take it. The other way in which this is existential, of course, is that this is part of a longer drawn-out attempt to vilify Russia, increasingly in Western media. On a global scale, that's an existential threat. Surely, when you view the nuclear weapons that we each still hold as parties, why do you think that's? I mean, this is one of those dummy questions, but I just want to sort of re-clarify, give some context. Why do you think that is taking place? You referenced a permanent national security intelligence establishment. I'm guessing that ties into it. What do you think is the ultimate agenda here? Or is there even one? Is it just, parties in power trying to keep power, trying to throw more money at weapons? What's your take, Alexander?
Right. To discuss all of that, but can I just first of all say this is obviously not Russian disinformation, and note that the people most directly involved, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Brennan himself, have not said that it was. So we mustn't let ourselves be thrown off course by these bogus allegations of Russian disinformation. It clearly wasn't. Now, there has been a long-standing campaign going back many years, going back into the early 2000s, to vilify Russia and to try to project Russia as an enemy and as an adversary of the United States. And unfortunately, what has happened over the last few years is that this campaign against Russia has become fused with US domestic politics, so that some people within the United States have tried to use association with Russia in order to vilify and discredit their opponents. This is a catastrophic consequence, because it, of course, makes any attempt to improve relations with Russia all but impossible. Why has it happened? I think the short answer is that obviously there are lots of people who have stand to make lots of money from all the new weapon systems and all of that goes with having a kind of renewed competition with Russia. But basically and overall, it is because Russia, after 1999, 2000, with the end of the Yeltsin era and the arrival of Mr. Putin, has started again to pursue an active foreign policy, which often disagrees with that of the United States, pushes back in places like Iraq and Syria and in the Balkans and elsewhere, and of course has managed to secure Russian control of Russia's natural resources, which were eyed with great interest by many people in the West. And this has created deep anger and deep resentment within the Washington bureaucracy, within all sorts of people in the West. and that has resulted in a massive rupture in relations. Of course, over and above and beyond that, there are also lots of people left over from the Cold War who are, hardwired to be hostile to Russia from that time, who are viscerally antagonistic to Russia, who always want to think of Russia as an enemy, and who besides see the raising up of this Russian, specter or bogey as a very good and effective way of maintaining bloc discipline in Europe, of keeping Europe, in a sense, subordinated to the Atlantic institutions, to NATO, to the alliance with the United States, which, if Europe ceased to believe that there was a threat from Russia, might prove to be a very difficult thing to do.
Alexander, thank you. We're going to be joined by Alexander on the other side of this segment. Alexander, for those listening, is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. On the other side, we're going to be talking about the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, also the meeting today happening in Geneva between the members of the Minsk group, that's France, Russia, and the United States, to try to mediate this conflict. We're going to be talking about the state of that conflict on the ground and its hopes for some relief in the near future. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're joined by Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief at the Duran. Alexander, I think I ended up stumbling onto and binge watching your show maybe like 3 episodes in last night. I thought it was amazing at the Duran. And you were talking about the subject, Nagorno-Karabakh. Well, I'm bringing up Nagorno-Karabakh now, but at the time I was watching your show, you were discussing it. And I enjoyed your point of view on it. I thought it was rational. I thought you gave a pretty good understanding and overview of what was going on. So I kind of want to engage in that topic right now. Recently, we've had more clashes. Stepanakert, the second largest city, has just been hit. Do we know what was the instigating factor in this yet? Because it seems that that's dodgy. And I look, my perspective of it is you have a Cold War of sorts. And in that Cold War, one of those sides get additional, let's say, firepower and gets what they believe is an advantage. And they start to press that advantage in order to regain what they consider to be theirs. Now, is my framing of this off, or is there something else that was an instigating factor in these two forces basically coming together?
I think you put it exactly right. I mean, this is a conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over a disputed territory, Nagorno-Karabakh, which is populated largely by Armenians, overwhelmingly by Armenians, but which was allocated by the Soviet Union to regional control by the Azerbaijani authorities in Baku. Now, in 1994, Nagorno-Karabakh broke away from Azerbaijan and essentially established itself as an independent entity allied to Armenia. And there has been a conflict ever since. And there's been, as you correctly say, a kind of Cold War between Armenia and Azerbaijan over this issue. Now, nothing happened that would have caused that situation to break down this year were it not for a decision by the government in Baku, by the government in Azerbaijan, to launch an offensive. What is really remarkable is that Azerbaijan has not alleged that there were any Armenian breaches of the ceasefire. They just took a decision to launch an offensive. The reason they took that decision was, I think, twofold. Firstly, Azerbaijan is a richer country than Armenia, or at least its government is richer because it is an oil producer and it has large revenues from oil and gas, and it has been heavily re-equipping its armed forces. So it feels itself, perhaps wrongly, to be in a position of military superiority over Armenia. Secondly, the situation in Azerbaijan, as in many places around the world, has become economically more complicated. The government there does not have democratic legitimacy. It's a kind of soft dictatorship. It was feeling, I think, extremely precarious. So relaunching this war by launching this offensive was perhaps a way of shoring up domestic support within Azerbaijan. But I think the single factor that has caused this conflict to explode in the way that it has over the last few weeks is the open advocacy and strong advocacy of Turkey, of the Erdogan government in Turkey for Azerbaijan, Turkey's decision to supply Azerbaijan with advisors and weapons, and its call to Azerbaijan to, in effect, reconquer Nagorno-Karabakh. So it is Turkey which has been driving this conflict. There is now a public intelligence assessment by the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, which effectively blames Turkey for the resumption of the conflict. And I think every objective observer looking at this conflict would agree that that was so. The question, why has this conflict restarted now, really needs to ask, why did Turkey decide to restart this conflict now? What was Erdogan's reasons for doing so? And of course, there are many reasons and many explanations for this. But it is in Turkey, in Ankara, that the decision was clearly made.
Russia's foreign intelligence chief has also warned that Nagorno-Karabakh could become a launch pad, a center for Islamist militants. This would be interesting and perhaps ironic. Of course, Turkey has claimed that it's been fighting Islamist militants while supporting rebels. It's much more complicated than that. But briefly, Alexander, do you think that could happen? Do you think that's likely or possible? What's your take on that?
I think that is certainly possible if Azerbaijan were able to regain control of Nagorno-Karabakh. And can I just make it very clear, if Azerbaijan reclaims control of Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh will either leave or be expelled. That is the nature of these conflicts in the Caucasus. When the Armenians gained control of Nagorno-Karabakh in 1994, the Azeri people who lived there, who were, a community there, they left or were expelled. And if Azerbaijan were to regain control, the reverse would be the case. Now, it would bring Nagorno-Karabakh under Azerbaijani control, but it is well known, even though it is denied in Baku and Ankara, that there are lots and lots of jihadi fighters migrating to fight in this region and doing so with Turkish encouragement. So once they establish themselves there, it is unlikely that they would leave. These people are very hostile to Russia, and their presence in Nagorno-Karabakh, or what would once have been Nagorno-Karabakh, would be a major threat to Russia. Russia fought a bitter war in the Caucasus against jihadi fighters throughout the 2000s. It eventually prevailed. It would be extremely concerned if it were to see a new jihadi force establish itself in the Caucasus again, with the danger that that war in the Caucasus would be reignited. Russia intervened in Syria to prevent Syria becoming a launch pad for a renewed jihadi offensive against Russia in the Caucasus. Of course, if that were to happen in Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russians would be even more concerned, since that is so much closer to home and is in the Caucasus itself.
Do you think Putin has influence on this? Now, what I mean by that is, like significant influence to call it and say, look, stop. I mean, I saw like you said, the meeting, the Minsk group is meeting. You have another situation where there's some kind of communications that are going on. France, for whatever reason, has been adding its point 2 cents in. I know it's part of the Minsk group. I'm just saying. I don't know what power Macron has in this situation. But is this one of those situations where it's like, look, cut it out? Or is it, this is to some degree out of control? Like, I guess I'm looking for what's the exit ramp for something like this? Or does it just go until the momentum runs out?
Russia is overwhelmingly in the strongest position of all the outside powers in the Caucasus. It has the most powerful military in the Caucasus by far. It is economically dominant in this region. What has, I think, been holding the Russians back from acting more decisively up to now is 2 factors. Firstly, they have worked very hard to develop good relations with Azerbaijan especially, but with Turkey also. And I think they don't want to put that in jeopardy. Secondly, they have a certain distrust for the present Armenian authorities. The current Prime Minister of Armenia, Mr. Pashinyan, came to power as a result of protests in Armenia, which overthrew a previous government that had been very closely aligned to Moscow. The Russians don't entirely trust Pashinyan. They see him as largely pro-American and pro-EU, and they're very distrustful of his motives and of his intentions. But ultimately, and in the end, if push comes to shove and diplomatic efforts to try to bring the fighting to a stop don't succeed, and if Turkey and Azerbaijan escalate this conflict further, the Russians will intervene. And they have overwhelming resources to do so. And they will do so in all kinds of ways, which will result, I am sure, in a quick end of this conflict. Probably what they will do is use diplomatic efforts first to try to broker a ceasefire. I predict, by the way, that those will succeed. The Russian Prime Minister is in Yerevan today. He's gone to Yerevan today. There are going to be consultations in Moscow on Monday. Both the Azerbaijani and the Armenian foreign ministers are expected to be present. And the Russians have built up a diplomatic coalition involving France and, in this instance, the United States. Both countries, by the way, France and the United States, having strong and vocal Armenian communities, which is why they've tended to take a pro-Armenian side in this. And I think if, at the end of the day, the Azerbaijanians and the Turks hold out for too long, they could very well find themselves facing a UN Security Council resolution brokered possibly by Russia and France, with action by Russia following to enforce it.
And I mean, another side of this, you brought up the meeting in Moscow on Monday. These are twin meetings happening within a week of each other. Again, today in Geneva, the 3 heads of the Minsk group from France, US, and Russia will be meeting. Azerbaijan's foreign minister said he will be visiting that meeting. Armenia's foreign minister said he would be visiting the meeting in Moscow on Monday. But what he said that they had ruled out a meeting with Azerbaijan's prime minister. Now, that could mean, and I want to get your take on this, that could mean that they would both be in the same place, but not necessarily at the same time, relying on the U.S., France, and again, most critically, Russia to mediate that. Is that where you see this going? And then one just quick add-on question. We only have a couple of minutes left here. What about NATO? Would NATO get involved, or are they just keeping this at arm's length for now? What's your take on where that's going to go, Alexander, both of those?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there will be mediation people in separate rooms. That's, by the way, the classic mediation exercise. And to be very clear, the mediators will be the Russians. It's the Russians who talk to Baku. It's the Russians who talk to Yerevan. And they will be the people who will be going backwards and forwards between the two sides, formulating ideas, imposing their ideas. In the end, I'm sure, achieving a ceasefire. The French and the US will be there, but it will be the Russians who will be doing all the work. And they will be doing it in Geneva, and they will be doing it closer at home in Moscow, where, of course, they're in a stronger position to apply even more influence. At the moment, NATO is keeping, to some extent, away from this because NATO is so bitterly divided. Stoltenberg, who is the NATO Secretary General, went to Ankara and basically seemed to be siding with Turkey because the very strong anti-Russian hardliners are pro-Turkey, anti-Russia. But I think other countries like France are against Turkey on this one.
Alexander, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us for both of these conversations. Those listening, you've been listening to the voice of Alexander Mercouris. He is the editor-in-chief at theduran.com. You're also listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back with more in just a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, tap dancing on the surface of a Dyson sphere, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A Dyson sphere, just for those of like, what the hell is a Dyson sphere? It's a very large object of a civilization that is far, far more advanced than ours that can basically harness the energy of the sun by building a ball around it and just absorbing it. Shane is throwing around his intelligence here. I love it.
No.
Early morning.
It would be better. The Dyson swarm, that's usually taken, I think, as the first step. And then you have the Dyson sphere that completely encases it. My only hope is that if we get to that point, we don't do it to our own sun. I like our sun. Got some fond feelings towards it. Anyway, back to you, Jamarl.
That would destroy Earth. That would kill Earth. Earth would find, it would take Earth 8 minutes to figure out that the sun is no longer putting out energy. It's being stolen from somebody else. Or better yet, another alien civilization that basically just steals our sun. Okay, let's get to the headlines.
Did you say better yet, Jamarl? Did you just say better yet?
I didn't mean better yet. I mean worse yet. I meant worse yet. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, talking over each other and dodging questions, Vice President Pence and Senator Kamala Harris clashed in their only debate this season. Pence defended the White House's decision to not require masks at events, saying that he and President Trump, quote unquote, trust the American people to make choices in the best interest of their health. Wow, that's an amazing statement. This follows Trump's hospitalization over the weekend due to the contraction of COVID-19. Kamala pushed back, saying that Trump couldn't be trusted to respond accurately to the pandemic. Let's talk about trusting the American people. You respect the American people when you tell them the truth. The debate was held on either side of a plexiglass divide added for the protection of the candidates. But what I see most people talking about on social media and the press is the fly that landed on Pence's head and sat there for 2 solid minutes. This includes Joe Biden, who during the debate solicited donations in a tweet that read, pitching $5 to help this campaign fly. No pun intended. Look, the problem that I have with this one, Shane, and I'm not going to keep it, and I'm going to throw it to you, but this defense of the White House not having a mandated mask policy. where the argument is basically made, I trust the American people to follow, to make choices in the best interest of their health. Yeah, but what about other people's health? I mean, understand what we're talking about here. The White House, who headed by the president, that people understood did not like people wearing masks because he saw it as unmanly. Yeah, unmanly. It was too unmanly. It was unseemly. And he looked down on people that wore it. This came from the top. And so, it's like people who work there, people who have kids, people who have family members, regardless of their ideology, they still may want to be, protected and not necessarily held to the whims of a particular president. And this cascades through the country. Like, that's an abominable argument to make. That people, you have, 20-30% of the country that look at Trump as a source of information. I don't even know if it's that high now. But those people are walking around. Those people are not wearing masks. Those people are taking information from the president. Oh, it's just like the flu. That type of nonsense. And yeah, I think it is getting people ill, sick, and I think this is an abominable and appalling argument to make. Well, am I being too harsh on this argument? I mean, how many people do you think Trump got infected? Just by himself.
I mean, the media is going to make it out to be a couple of dozen, and I don't know how many of those couple dozen that have been reported infected so far were infected by Trump. But I mean, whether it's Trump or his administration, the weight's going to come down on him.
Yeah, I just mean
and it's the White House's policy. Yeah, I hear you on that one. I totally hear you on that one. And that, ultimately, Trump is where the buck should stop. That's where everybody's going to assume the buck does stop. And I think his response to that is going to determine what some of the electorate thinks. But again, the people who are against him are going to be against him. The people who are for him are by and large going to be for him. There's even a question of whether the swing vote really exists in this election or at this point in America's history. I don't know. Probably does, but maybe in smaller numbers than some political agents hope.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's in smaller numbers. People just seem to be hardened. If you love them or hate them. There doesn't seem to be too much of an in-between. Following a request from President Donald Trump of Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe on Tuesday, declassified documents that reveal former CIA Director John Brennan briefed former President Barack Obama on Hillary Clinton's purported plan, quote unquote, to tie then candidate Donald Trump to Russia as a means of distracting the public from her use of a private email server, that's a quote unquote, ahead of the 2016 presidential election. Included in the documents that Ratcliffe released Tuesday were handwritten notes from 2016 by then CIA Director John Brennan after he briefed the president on a U.S. intelligence assessment of narratives that Russian security services were pushing at the time. Now, right here, quote, we're getting additional insight into Russian activities from Redacted. Brennan note reads, including a plan from one of Hillary Clinton's advisors, a proposal from one of her foreign advisors, to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service. The note also included one-line comment which reads, any evidence of collaboration between Trump campaign plus Russia. Trump's tweets announcing the release reads, I have fully authorized the total declassification of any and all documents pertaining to the single greatest political crime in American history, the Russia hoax. Likewise, the Hillary Clinton email scandal, no redactions. Let's just hope Trump gets his way. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow counting for the 2020 census to end soon. This comes as an emergency request on Wednesday from Acting Solicitor General Jeffrey Wall. In the request, Wall said that the Census Bureau must immediately wrap up its field operations now that it's past the Bureau's internal target date of October 5th in order to have a chance of meeting the legal deadline for delivering the first set of census results to President Donald Trump by year end. The administration's move comes hours after the Federal Appeal Court rejected the earlier attempt to block lower court's order to extended the counting timeline for the census in order to give the Bureau more time to get an accurate count. For now, the judges ruled the tally of the country's residents must keep going through October 31st. Turkey's parliament extended a motion to allow government authority to launch cross-border military operations in Iraq and Syria for one more year. The motion had previously allowed the Turkish armed forces to carry out cross-border operations from October 30th, 2018 until October 30th, 2019. All political parties except pro-Kurdish People's Party at the parliament supported the motion. The motion came ahead of Turkey's planned military operation in the east of Euphrates in northern Syria. Up to 150 million people could slip into extreme poverty, living on less than $1.90 a day by late next year, depending on how badly economies shrink during the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Bank said Wednesday. Some 82% of the people entering the extreme poverty are expected to be in middle-income countries such as India, Nigeria, and Indonesia, the bank said. Many will be more educated urban residents, meaning cities will see an increase in the kind of poverty traditionally rooted in rural areas. The coronavirus is expected to drive 3.3% contraction in sub-Saharan African economies in 2020. It could push 40 million people into extreme poverty, the World Bank said on Thursday. The Washington-based lender said growth in the region would recover in 2021, with economies growing by 2.1%, below 2019's growth to 2.4%. The bank said the pandemic has put a decade of hard-won economic progress at risk. You know my take on this. We, in this world, in fact, I would go further. I would say China alone, China by itself, could probably supply all of the world's needs. I mean, from the standpoint of just material supplies, in the same way that the United States by itself, with a fourth less number of people, could do so in the Second World War. There's no excuse. There's just no excuse. Even with a pandemic, even with a virus, there's no excuse. We have technological means to ensure that each and every one of us, food, clothing, shelter, clean water, clean air, and, being able to work in a capacity where they feel that they have some kind of association with something. There's no excuse that our world, from the standpoint of a virus, something that we get and have gotten for eons, or for as long as humanity has puddled about, to be laid this low. None. And a lot of this, honestly, has to do with just poverty. Like, if you look at the United States, which section of the country is hit the hardest? Well, the middle class, and the higher the income, the better off that person fared. And so the lower incomes in the country, the ones that were doing the worst, were hit the hardest. And unfortunately, I would probably make this point that this is probably what it looks like around the world. You have less ability to defend yourself from things like illness or from things like going into, a work site, as opposed to being able to stay at home and stay well. Shane, we have this conversation about a technological solution to this stuff, or even about rational planning that doesn't seem to take place. And it is entirely ideological. Even though rational planning, fair enough, is to some degree ideological also, it is at the very least ideological to a standpoint of science, health, what is the best way of resources to be distributed, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not capitalism, socialism, anything else. You can call it whatever you want to call it. I'm just making the point that the ability to use technology to get resources to other human beings in a way that those people are not in depravity. What do you think, Shane?
There's that old proverb, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Basically meaning when you have these larger conflicts, it's usually the poorest, the weakest, who ultimately suffer the most from those conflicts. In a weird way, on a global scale, the elephant appears to be fighting with itself. Yes, sure, there are confrontations on the global scale, not only between individual nation states, between world organizations and those nation states, but on the highest level, it seems, between different modes of keeping this whole thing going. The elephant itself is trembling, it's starting to falter, and the grass, while it trembles, continues to get trampled on. Now, with your point about technology, we have some of the material technologies, and we could and should be developing more. But frankly, what I think we need to really focus on are social technologies. Things like how to run our governments, how to function, in a hospitable society, how to create that society, how to maintain it, all these things. I think that in some sense we've lost that way. Maybe we never had it. Maybe we had it and didn't know that we had it, and we haven't preserved it. Those are admittedly vague statements. I kind of want to come back to this at the end of the show if we've got time for it, if you're down.
Of course I'm down for it, always. There's one point that I want to make about what you just said about the elephants trembling. One thing that also applies to political parties. And this argument of, when people at the top fight, the people at the bottom take the hit. Well, think of it in terms of one party, the Democratic Party. You have one side that has two factions, and there may be more, but specifically two factions. One, poor workers, the other one, oligarchs. And in these two factions, you have a situation where the oligarchs say, look, if we lose, you're going to take the hit. So just shut up and just vote for us, and we will throw things to you every so often. And for 40, 50 years, lefties said, okay. And I'm saying at some point, they need to confront that and deal with that. Because like you said, at some point, you need to reconcile those contradictions in your system. And that's one, just specifically in the political party itself, that needs to be undermined. Let's go to the very next one. I'm going to go through this one real quick, running to the end. But Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro says he has ended the country's biggest ever corruption probe, Operation Car Wash, as there were no more corruption in the government. Love that. Love that. Launched 6 years ago, the investigation put some of the biggest names in Brazilian politics and business behind bars, including left-wing former President Lula da Silva, who accused the judiciary of working to criminalize the left, quote unquote, after the Supreme Court ordered the release last November. Operation Car Wash, which last month extended Brazil's Attorney General until January 31st, upended Brazilian politics and businesses since it was launched as money laundering probe. Recently, critics have accused the task force of pushing its aggressive tactics too far, provoking twin and economic crisis and undermining suspects' rights to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. It also faces accusations of playing politics, particularly after leaked communications appeared to show investigators conspiring to keep Lula, a left-wing icon, from staging a comeback in Brazil's 2018 presidential race. Lula, who was the most popular candidate, was barred from contesting the election that Bolsonaro won. And those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we will take a break. We will be back in a moment. Stay tuned.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly...
No Taylor just yet?
...of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Quick note here, you can give us a call pretty much anytime you want to during the show. We will try to get you in, and usually we're actually getting pretty good about that, particularly during guest segments. If you have any questions with guests, feel free to call in. We will bring you in. The number there is 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. And by the way, if you guys live in the DC area, you can catch us on the radio there at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. And last but not least, I'm going to tell you where you can check us out. For our audio options online, you can check us out on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. Each of those destinations hosts the audio-only form of this show. If you want to watch us on video, there are two main options right now. Go to YouTube and either search for Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either of those searches will take you directly to channels to which you can subscribe. We have live video going there every morning from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. That's 4 to 7 a.m. Pacific. And by the way, they each have chat rooms too, so feel free to join in there. But without further ado, we have our guest, Taylor Hudak, coming to us live from London, last I heard at least, during the ongoing Julian Assange trial. We're talking with her about Assange, getting an update. And I also want to get into a couple of minutes, I'm pretty sure we'll have time, onto two bills pushed by Tulsi Gabbard, proposed by Tulsi Gabbard, one co-sponsored with Tom Cotton, another just her, HR 8452. But we'll come back to that. Taylor, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm just going to start right here. I'm guessing you're still in London. Can you please give us an update there on what you've seen since we last had you?
Yeah, so actually, I just recently returned back to the United States. I was in London for about 5 or 6 weeks. And the hearing did conclude. Again, this was Julian Assange's full extradition hearings. For those watching, if they're unaware, Julian Assange is the founder of WikiLeaks. He is also a journalist and publisher charged under 17 counts under the U.S. Espionage Act of 1917 and 1 count of conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. So, as I said, the hearing concluded, yet there has not been a decision made. Judge Vanessa Baratzer is going to make a final decision on January 4th of 2021. I believe it was the decision to postpone a decision was due to the United States election that is coming up in a few weeks here. In the U.S., I can say that it's not too unusual that a judge will delay a decision on a hearing. It's not something that's common, but it's not too rare in the U.S., whereas I'm not sure if this is something that happens typically in the U.K. or not. But again, we'll hear that decision next year. The last week of the hearing, we heard some pretty powerful statements from 2 anonymous witnesses, and they were both employees of the Spanish security firm UC Global or Undercover Global. UC Global was under the direction of David Morales. They were basically conducting an illegal spying operation on Julian Assange. I want to be clear here that this was done by the direction of American intelligence. Essentially, American intelligence contracted the CEO of the UC Global, David Morales, to spy on Assange through this private company being UC Global. Initially, UC Global was hired to protect the embassy, protect Julian Assange, as well as the Ecuadorian employees who were there. And then it turned into an illegal spying operation. We heard their testimony, which just verified information that we were already aware of, and that there were extensive efforts to collect information on Julian Assange himself, gather his fingerprints, also spy on his communications with his attorneys, and also the most sinister of them all were plans to possibly assassinate Julian Assange by poisoning him or kidnapping him. So we heard that the last week of the court hearing.
You muted.
That's extraordinary.
That's hard. Yeah.
That's a bombshell. Like when you hear that, like assassinate or kill, like that, it's rather jarring to the ears. Let me ask you this: You've watched this case. I mean, you've been there for a very long time, and you've been very passionate on it. You've been on my show, if I'm not mistaken, at least once, talking about this. Was this a fair trial? Meaning, when all of this came to pass, and you got the opportunity to put on witnesses and everything else, do you think the rulings were not politically inspired? Like, do you believe that they got to have some level of communication? And don't misunderstand me. I know the glass box. I know the difficulty. And maybe you can just make the argument that those things in and of itself make it an unfair trial. But I'm going to give it to you. How did you think this trial went?
Yes. Yeah, so beyond things that I've already spoken about as far as the glass box and just the inherent unfairness of the way the court is set up, in my opinion, I want to begin by saying that, no, I do not believe that he received a fair hearing. It just came out recently, and this was an investigation that was done by Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis through Declassified UK. One of the U.S. prosecution witnesses, Dr. Nigel Blackwood, works for the Institute of Psychiatry, which is funded by the UK military. He also leads a research group which works in collaboration with an organization or a center that is set up with U.S. Department of Defense funding. Again, this is a U.S. prosecution witness. That's just one example of the conflicts of interest in the case. Now, here are some other issues. Judge Vanessa Baretzer is being overseen by the previous judge here in the case, which is Lady Arbuthnot. Lady Arbuthnot's husband is very closely linked to the UK military establishment, as well as the U.S. military establishment and intelligence community. He has also been implicated in WikiLeaks documents. Her son is also has an interesting background and has worked and been very closely affiliated with an anti-data leaking company whose ideals very much clash with that of Assange's and that of WikiLeaks. There's a lot more to it that I could get into, but that's just a basic overview of the clear conflicts of interest in this case. Another point that was brought up is that this is a political case. Again, we're going into an election in the United States, and it came out in court. This was through the testimony of Cassandra Fairbanks, who is a journalist and a friend of Julian Assange, that President Trump personally requested for Assange to be arrested. And she notified Assange of this. She traveled to London to let him know of this. And once she returned back to the United States, again, she's an American journalist. Once she returned back to the United States, it became clear to her that those in power in the U.S., specifically Grinnell, were aware that she spoke to Assange and let him know that he was going to, it was highly likely he was going to face charges. And that put her at a great risk. But we heard from her testimony, which was really, really powerful, and again spoke to the political nature of this case. And under the U.S.-UK extradition treaty, an individual cannot be extradited from the UK to the U.S. For political purposes.
There's also, however, this follows the revelation. This came from Julian Assange's barrister, Jennifer Robinson, that the Trump administration, or associates of Trump at least, had offered Assange a quote-unquote win-win deal, where basically in exchange for Assange revealing information on who had leaked the DNC emails to WikiLeaks, in exchange for that, Trump would pardon Assange. This is probably putting a silver lining on a cloud where none exists, but do you think that there was any hope, or that the idea here was, if Trump arrests Assange, if Trump brings Assange effectively, successfully back to the U.S., he can then pardon him, or is that just putting lipstick on a pig? What's your take, Taylor?
Yeah, that is not, some people may argue that. That is not a fair assessment, I would say. By any means, if Assange is extradited, he is going to be put into a supermax prison. This is also something that was addressed in the court. He would be held under SAMs, or special administrative measures, which are very, very horrific conditions. And he would be held in ABC, or Alexandria Detention Center, pre-trial, where it would be very difficult for him to speak with his attorneys. In fact, one of the defense witnesses, who was an attorney that represented an individual who was also subjected to SAMs, he said that he had to scream through the door to even speak to his client. Otherwise, the only way they could really speak was when the food tray opening was opened. That's the only time they could really speak and hear each other. But other than that, they had to yell to just talk to one another. Also, Assange being held under these measures in the United States, he would not be able to speak with his family, his friends. He would have to schedule a call 2 weeks in advance to ensure that a FBI agent would be available to monitor the call. So there's no privacy whatsoever. The conditions would just be awful. And then also, too, being tried in the U.S. Eastern District Court of Virginia, there's a 100% conviction rate for national security defendants, and Assange would be a national security defendant, so the odds are not in his favor.
Taylor, what happens here if he wins, if he loses? I have to be honest, this was one of those cases that I thought was going to be tragic regardless of how it ended. Because if Assange walks, that means he's been in an embassy for 7 or 8 years of his life that has just been absorbed for doing God's work, if we're being honest. If he loses, again, horrible. So I just felt like there was no great outcome to this because the penalty had already, for the most part, been already stuck in. But what happens next if he loses this? And what happens next if he wins this?
Well, it's very interesting you bring up that point because Lori Love, who is an activist and computer scientist in the UK, who successfully fought extradition from the UK to the US and has been going through exactly what Assange is going through. He has even said that the process itself can be the punishment. And you're right, Assange has been in the embassy. He was there for 7 years. He was being spied on during that time. For much of that time, it was not an easy stay there. And people who were there while he was there have been able to attest to this as well and say that it was not easy conditions, and there are going to be serious psychological and physical impacts on him for years to come. What we do know legally is that whichever decision the judge makes, if she grants extradition or denies extradition, either side is highly likely going to appeal. Then it will go to the appeals court, which is, I guess the best way to describe it is a level above the current court that's hearing the case. And so then a higher ranking judge would make a final decision. In that time period, Assange could be in prison throughout that entire time. And again, this could go on for years. It could go on for years. We don't really know at this point. I expect that come January 4th, we'll have some additional information once this judge makes her ruling.
Taylor, I want to thank you for joining us. This is Taylor Hudak, journalist and co-founder of Action for Assange. We will be right back. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory. That airs Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. That's from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific for those on the West Coast. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Stranahan. Also check out his channel on YouTube at populous.tv and Citizen Journalism School. Lee, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. All right, I'll start it off like this. This is not what we brought you on to talk about, but I just want to check in real quick. What did you think of the debate last night? What did you think of Kamala and Pence?
Well, I thought Kamala Harris came off very badly, generally. She was unlikable and scoldy. And I thought, I kind of think this every time I see Pence. He's a good professional politician. He just comes off as a solid, for leaving policy aside, he just comes off as a somewhat boring but solid performer. And I think that's important in contrast to Trump, who is, throwing punches wildly, but that's Trump's strength, actually. And that's why Trump beat Biden. On policy, I thought it was interesting the way Kamala, I said this on Twitter, but the big winner last night seemed to be fracking. If I was fracking, I would have been thrilled with last night's debate because I just thought it was a very, very interesting position where Kamala Harris kept saying over and over again, hey, don't worry, fracking, you're safe. We like you fracking. And I didn't know fracking was very popular among the Democratic base. I thought that was a weird point for her to keep making. And no, we emphatically, Joe Biden will not end fracking. They had no position on the Green New Deal, really. She's kind of all over the place on it. And on stuff like the other thing that was disturbing, especially after Joe Biden's performance, was that the Democrats won't answer the question about whether they're going to pack the court. And I think people sort of have a right to know whether they're planning to pack the court. And I think the obvious answer is they're clearly planning to pack the court, and they don't want to say it out loud. So that was my short take on the debate.
You know, it's funny. As I hear you take the fracking thing, like, and you was like, I didn't know that the base loved fracking that much. Who knew that the Democratic base was just, sold on oil, just rubbing their bodies in oil? No. This is kind of one of those things that I keep making the point. They don't care what the base thinks. The base is a captured lot. It is that horse out back that stands there in the rain, in the cold, in the snow, gets beat, kicked, called names, and yet it stays. It's not even connected to anything. It just stays. That's the base. So yeah, you can go out there and say fracking is the greatest thing ever, and you are going to be safe forever under our administration. They can do that, and the base will stand there. They can say the Green New Deal is trash, and the base will stand there. They can go so far as to pee in the cereal and give it to everybody around the country, everybody a Democrat, all of them drink it. Everybody knows it's from Joe Biden, and they would still go vote for Joe Biden. I'm trying to give you this impression of how broken the base is of the Democratic Party. So yeah, they can get out there and say that. I mean, from your standpoint, do you honestly believe anything that she said last night? And I agree with you. She's unlikable. To me, I think she's effective as a prosecutor, but this is not a prosecutorial thing. Mike Pence stands there and actually does a decent job of defending Trump. I mean, even back when Tim Kaine, if you remember, Trump was throwing bombshells. And Tim Kaine and Pence get into that debate, and people in that debate thinking Pence won. It's like, whoa, how did that happen? So I agree with you on the solid politician thing. What do you think happened going forward? Do you think Trump wins this, or do you think Trump gets put down in a landslide? Like, how do you think, I'm curious from your perspective of the political persuasion, how do you think this shakes out?
Yeah, I don't know. And, I've been saying this for months. It's the only thing I know, and I've been saying this, and now it's kind of explicit, is that it's going to be a contested election. And I've been saying that for a long time, that I don't know who's going to win. And part of the reason is the lengths to which the Democrats will go to defeat Trump. I mean, it's obvious they're willing to cheat or bend the rules or do whatever they have to do to beat him. And it's also obvious a fair amount of establishment Republicans will go along with that. So the playing field is no longer, if it wasn't level in 2016, it's much less level now. Now, the problem is the court, the Democrats have been doing things like trying to extend the date that you can take mail-in ballots, for instance, right? And they push it like 2 weeks. And then the courts have been like, well, that's a little illegal. Maybe you shouldn't really do that. So I really don't know. The only thing I know is that, to me, the over or under is if the election's called on Thanksgiving or not. That's the over or under. And by the way, and I think the COVID thing, I think having COVID helped Donald Trump. I think ultimately, assuming he's alive on election day, and if I've said this, if he dies from COVID, I think the race is over for him. But if he makes it through to election day, which it sure seems like he's going to, then it's a winner for him, because Joe Biden seems like, frankly, a nanny scold, and his reliance on, hey, if you vote for me, I'll make you wear a mask, is not really going to play in large portions of the country, especially the large portions of the country where people aren't wearing a mask because they don't feel like they need to wear one. And again, you don't really need to wear a mask. That's why I don't know if you saw that Bill de Blasio video. The fact that they freaked out that Donald Trump took a mask off so he could go into his own home, the White House, where he lives, was a little weird to me. The media had a complete spazoid reaction to that. And the fact is, whatever you think of mask, I don't need to be wearing a mask right now. I just don't. I'm not near anybody. And, when I walk across a parking lot and I'm not within 20 feet of anybody outdoors, I don't need to wear a mask. And Biden's making, hey, I'm going to make everybody wear a mask, a focal point of his campaign. And again, I think Trump recovering not only helped Trump, but it hurt the COVID narrative that is clearly being politically pushed right now, whatever you think medically. And again, I'm not somebody who's been, COVID's not real, but it's clearly so politicized right now that effectively it's everybody's confused.
Very, very interesting takes. Yeah, no, we could have a whole conversation about this, but I want to make sure that we get to the topics we brought you on to talk about: the declassification of documents, investigation of Joe Biden, and Ukraine resurfacing with that investigation. That was breaking from Paul Sperry. I saw that yesterday. Do you think what do you think that's referring to? Where do you think that's going, Lee? Let's just start there.
Okay, well, so Paul Sperry is I talked about this on the backstory yesterday, and I'm allowed to say this because I'm blind in one eye. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, is a phrase people use. And in a land of really crappy reporting on Russiagate, Paul Sperry is a standout because he's not really crappy. He's only fairly crappy. And his fairly crappiness comes from the fact that Sperry is a limited hangout. They've been hiding this Strobe Talbot stuff and the Cody Shearer stuff that I've been talking about for about 3 years now. To anyone who will listen, as Shane, someone related to me, knows.
Consistently, very consistently, you've been talking about this. This, along with Ukraine, has practically been your story. I don't mean to diminish the other reporting you've done, but that has been, your key focus along with the wider Russiagate scandal. I'm
very ponderous. And so I've been talking about this for a long time. And the reason I've been talking about it is it's freaking obvious. It's not even like there's no subtlety here. Talbot was, and the more that gets revealed, the more we find out that this Strobe Talbot, when he was head of Brookings, Igor Darshenko was the primary subsource who worked at Brookings, that Igor Darshenko also was part of the Open World Leadership Center for 5 years. That's connected to Soros and Khodorkovsky, the Cody Shearer and Derek Shearer connections. They just, everything that gets revealed, it just is more like, well, yeah, that's what Lee's been talking about. But again, I don't want to be the only one talking about it. I just have been. So Sperry has been putting out stuff, for instance, about this woman Wallander, for instance. And he's put out that she was recommended by Derek Shearer. Now, Derek Shearer is the guy, part of the Shearer family, goes back with Bill Clinton 50 plus years, 1969, when Bill Clinton was a student at Oxford. Derek and Cody Shearer are the brother-in-laws of Strobe Talbot, Bill Clinton's Oxford roommate. Derek Shearer was Strobe Talbot's Yale roommate in 68 when they graduated. So these are people who are as close to Clinton as you can possibly be. Now, the significant thing about Sperry's reporting is that Donald Trump retweeted it. That to me is the most significant thing, because as lame and incomplete as Sperry's reporting is, Sperry is trying to push this idea that Igor Darshenko, the suspected Russian spy, that this is, see, here's what the narrative is on the right now. It is Putin, and there is a Russiagate, but really it's with the Democrats. That's literally what they're trying to push. No. Look, Christopher Steele, he was the one working with the Russians and a suspected Russian spy.
Basically, the Republicans are making it, like you're saying, the Republicans are making it about the Democrats working with the Russians. The Democrats are making it about the Republicans working with the Russians. Each side is really just blaming Russia here. That's what it comes down to, right?
That's exactly right. That all roads lead to blame Russia. And by Russia, I mean Putin. You got to understand, I mean, you do, but you got to understand that the other thing they do is that Russia is just a catch-all for anybody in Russia, that they're just anybody. And so, by the way, if this was a Russian plot, I would fire whoever at the FSB was in charge of this, because it had the effect of creating gigantic sanctions on Russia. I mean, I would say that it backfired in a big way. If this is a Russian plot, somebody needs at least a demotion or some sort of lose their parking space, something, because it's been horrible. But the whole idea is absurd. Anybody who understands the slightest bit about Russia, which, by the way, nobody does, but anybody who looks at it slightly and goes, well, Putin and Khodorkovsky don't like each other, for instance. Nobody knows who Khodorkovsky is. But if they even understood that, they'd go, well, yeah, clearly Brookings is an anti-Russia think tank. But like I say, life is long, and Sperry's reporting is keeping the story alive and putting the names Cody Shearer and Derek Shearer out there again. And these other declassifications, I have a bold prediction to make. We're going to find out more about the way these guys were involved. So that's where we are right now.
Lee, thank you for that answer. We've got to go into a break. We are joined by Lee Stranahan. He's the host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik. That airs Monday through Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern and from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific. We'll be back with him in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. There have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Lee Stranahan. It's Thomas and Stranahan and Stranahan. He's my dad, and he's a Sputnik News analyst and the host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, I want to get your take on this. You brought up Strobe Talbot, you brought up Cody Shearer and Derek Shearer. Those are big names that you've been covering for a long time. I'm sure you're gratified to see those coming to light. I just want to ask this, though. In the documents Ratcliffe released on Tuesday, Brennan's handwriting, I'm just going to quote here, a proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service. Quote, and quote, I want to get your take. Who is that foreign policy advisor?
My guess would be Strobe Talbot. That would be my guess, but I could be completely wrong. And it could end up being Fiona Hill, or it could end. There's other people. It could be, but let me point out what I think is more significant about that. That is also code, you've got to understand, think about it. It's easy. If you actually understand the story, that's a big deal. Now, first off, that date, August 26th, right? If you look at the date, that's literally right in the middle of the Democratic Convention. The Democratic Convention was the 25th, 26th, and 27th of 2016. So that's literally what that report is saying that Ratcliffe released, is that on August 26th, and I'm going to fill it in the middle of the Democratic Convention, that Hillary Clinton approved a proposal to blame Russia. Now, putting that timing on it is important. Saying it's in the middle of the Democratic Convention is important because let's talk about the context of what happened there. There was a Republican convention, then there was a short break, then the Democratic Convention in 2016. And I know because I covered them both. And so I had to go to Cleveland. There was a short break, then we went to Philly. And I believe you were you with me in Philly, Shane?
I don't think I was. No, I think you went. No, I don't think I was. I was with you in D.C., but not out of Philly.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to, because it's you. I was doing a lot of on the road reporting at the time, and you were with me a bunch of the time. Jack was my son. Jack was with me a bunch of the time, and it's just I'm old, and it's not now 4 years ago. It's easy to forget, but between those two conventions is when the first big WikiLeaks drop of material came, not the Podesta material, but the DNC material. And that's the period that Debbie Wasserman Schultz had to quit and everything else. Now, the reason that's significant is you remember when it came out, Donna Brazile, one of the first revelations from that was that Donna Brazile had given debate answers.
She'd given the questions. She'd given the questions in advance of the debate, right?
That's right, yes. And that was a big scandal. And I remember the reason I got interested in this is Donna Brazile immediately said, it's Russia. She said, well, we don't even know if these emails are true. It turned out, obviously, that they are true. But her first response was Russia. Okay. And that was during the DNC because it was in that same period. So first off, if you look at the context, that's significant. And it actually makes sense that happened based on what we know, which is the Democrats were immediately blaming Russia for it. So if Hillary Clinton approved something, yeah, okay, fine. But here's the other thing that's really significant about this. Don't look at this from your perspective for a second, because you and anybody listening is going to miss something that's important here because you're not Russophobic, and it's easy to miss. The reason they're saying Russian intelligence sources said that they believe that is to discredit it. In other words, that's basically the same as going, Hitler and Charlie Manson said, blah, blah, blah. At that point, if you go, well, Hitler and Charlie Manson said,
it's
probably
denigration.
Probably bad.
Yeah, it's basically saying, I love that you said that. Because you're right. I mean, that's basically what all of that Russia stuff is about. It's like, oh, Russia's putting that out in order to, it's fake. It's not good. It's et cetera, et cetera. And if you ally with this, yeah, it's the boogeyman stuff.
It's discredited. That's what they're doing. They're saying it's discredited, and it's easy for us to miss that. Us being people who don't hate Russia reflexively. You see what I'm saying? Because we're just like, oh, really? So Russia. Okay, that's interesting. And then we listen. But what they're trying to do is discredit it, and that's why they put it out.
Absolutely. Okay, you know what? I want to get to another side of this. We briefly mentioned Ukraine. This obviously for most people, this is going to have to do with Hunter Biden. A lot of people have heard about Ukraine through Hunter Biden. Of course, the impeachment centered on Ukraine. That was a big highlight there. And of course, this is all coming under the backdrop of the quote unquote Russian invasion of Crimea, which, as you know, is an absolute lie. Could you actually, you know what, could we just start there for a second? I was going to ask you, and maybe we can lead into this, what the real story on Ukraine is. People think Hunter Biden. Joe Biden has dismissed his involvement there, but wasn't he the viceroy of Ukraine? Wasn't he effectively the head of America's operations in Ukraine, Lee?
He was, but again, so the big issue with Ukraine is that the United States and the CIA, through the CIA and the State Department, right? And by the way, this is why Brennan's involved, tried to overthrow the government of Ukraine and successfully did do that. They overthrew the democratically elected government in Ukraine, replaced it with a puppet government, and then used that puppet government's mechanisms, including NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which we helped set up and that the FBI was an office at, to try to overthrow the election. Now, that entire part about the United States overthrew a government in Ukraine is completely ignored by everybody in the mainstream media. In fact, when and people are surprised that I get persnickety about this stuff, but it's not. And I get, like, so for instance, when Glenn Beck started talking about this story, a lot of people were like, "Hey, Glenn Beck's talking about the Ukraine, and Lee, you should be happy." And I'm like, "But he's getting it wrong." And they're like, "Well, but give him some credit." I'm like, no. He's fundamentally getting it wrong. And where he fundamentally got it wrong, and where every reporter on the right gets it wrong, is they never say, "Hey, the problem started when the U.S. overthrew the government of the Ukraine, replaced it with a puppet government." So if you look at that, think about it. We overthrew a government, that's bad. Replace it with a puppet government, that's bad. And then use that puppet government to interfere in an election. That's really, really bad. That's really, really bad. It compounds how bad it is.
And real quick, I want to halt there. When you say we used the Ukrainian government to interfere in our election, this was against Donald Trump. This has to do with Alexandra Chalupa, Paul Manafort. That's, I suppose, one end at least of where it starts. Can you please get into that for just a second?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the obvious thing is on August 14th, I think, but in August, mid-August, the New York Times initially ran their story about Paul Manafort. And what they said was Paul Manafort's name had been found in a secret ledger in Ukraine. Now, that story ended up Manafort leaving the Trump campaign 3 days later. Turns out that story is not true, and that's, so right there, that had an effect on the election. The Trump campaign manager was forced out and later indicted due to being targeted by the Democrats. Now, how did they do that? The mechanism they used was the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine put out these statements that Manafort's name was found in this black ledger.
That's NABU, of course. You just mentioned that, NABU, but just to be clear, which the FBI has an office in.
That's right. Which means, by the way, that, and the purpose of the FBI office is to monitor any activities that group is doing that involves Americans. So Comey absolutely knew about it. Now, again, there's not a question here. This is the most obvious thing in the world, and yet no one talks about it. And the reason no one talks about it is the Democrats and the Republicans and their respective media lackeys, and that's what a guy like Sperry is, unfortunately. What they don't want to do is ever question the underlying deep state premise. Why was the U.S. State Department, CIA, et cetera, involved in Ukraine at all? Because they never want to question the premise that Russia's evil and that Russia, in the personage of Vladimir Putin, is evil. Because that, everybody agrees on that. So Lindsey, you've got the spectacle of Lindsey Graham talking about how horrible the Steele dossier is, when his longtime companion, John McCain, was the guy spreading the Steele dossier. And no one says, "Hey, Lindsey, I thought your buddy McCain loved the Steele dossier so much that he and the guy who worked for the McCain Institute, who now pled the fifth, were out there spreading this." So, but no one can question the premise, nobody on the Democratic or Republican side, hey, maybe this is a way to lie about Putin because we wanted to use Ukraine. And they did. They literally used the government of Ukraine to interfere in the election. So.
And that's, again, this is shocking. The backdrop for that, again, though, I mean, it might make it worse, but the backdrop is already pretty bad. We overthrew a democratically elected government there. We do that sort of thing, and it's easy to forget it. And then we blamed it on Russia. All that we focused on there, all that we focused on the other side of that was Russia's occupation, Russia's presence really in Crimea at the request of Crimeans. Go for it. Only a minute left, but yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and let me just point this out. The ultimate irony is that Joe Biden, who keeps talking about Charlottesville and tiki torch wielding Nazis, made him run, supported literally the inspiration, the actual tiki torch wielding Nazis in Ukraine. So Biden supported the Nazis, the far right people, McCain, Biden, that whole group. We supported the bad guys in Ukraine, the actual tiki torch wielding, blood and soil flag waving Nazis. And that's the complete irony.
It is, and I can't help but wish that Trump had pushed back on Biden when Biden brought up Charlottesville, that he had pushed back on Biden for his presence in Ukraine, for his involvement there, and like you're saying, for the actual tiki torch wielding Nazis.
And just one quick point. I know it's 30 seconds, but the significance of Nazis and attacking Russians is mind-blowing, and basically that's what these guys were backing.
Absolutely. For those listening, that was Lee Stranahan, Sputnik News analyst and host of The Backstory, airing Monday through Friday on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. Lee, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back in just a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back live, coming to you from across the divided states of America as the most disruptive show in those states. In the politically independent corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. You know what? I'm just going to send out a quick note. We're getting down to the end of the week. We are going to be off. This show is not going to be running on Monday. It's a federal holiday, so we try to give people advance notice. No, we haven't been taken down. Nothing like that. We didn't catch COVID and we're suddenly all hunkered down. No, we're just going to be off the air. It's a holiday. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the headlines. Talking over each other and dodging questions, Vice President Pence and Senator Kamala Harris clashed in their only debate this season. Pence defended the White House's decision to not require masks at events, saying that he and President Trump, quote, trust the American people to make choices in the best interests of their health, end quote. This follows Trump's hospitalization over the weekend due to the contraction of COVID-19. By the way, it is just coming out. I've just seen it reported that he is off all medications for COVID, except for steroids. He's apparently still on steroids. I'm guessing that they're referring there to dexamethasone, but that's just a guess. During the debate, Kamala pushed back on the decision not to require masks at events, saying that Trump couldn't be trusted to respond accurately to the pandemic. Quote, let's talk about trusting the American people. You respect the American people when you tell them the truth, end quote. That again was Kamala Harris. That debate was held on either side of a plexiglass divide added for the protection of the candidates. What I see most people talking about on social media and in the press, however, is the fly that landed on Pence's head and sat there for a solid 2 minutes. The people talking about that include Joe Biden, who during the debate solicited donations in a tweet that read, quote, pitch in $5 to help this campaign fly, end quote. I mean, I'm going to be honest. That's a lazy pun. I could have done a couple of better variations of that. It's the lowest common denominator pun. Not that I'm not a pun expert, but
I'm actually kind of digging that.
That's just my brief take.
I kind of dig that.
You like it?
I got in kind of a deadpan way, maybe. I don't know. I'm not going to hate on it.
I hear you.
And maybe I'm neutral on it.
And almost any pun is a good pun. I'm just, on the scale of puns, that's underwhelming. Anyway, following Trump's request The DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, has on Tuesday declassified documents that revealed former CIA Director John Brennan briefed former President Obama on Hillary Clinton's purported plan to tie then-candidate Donald Trump to Russia as, quote, a means of distracting the public from her use of a private email server, end quote. This came ahead, of course, of the 2016 presidential election. Really, I should say, during that electoral cycle, it's during the heat of that. This is another quote from the disclosed notes here. Quote, we're getting additional insight into Russian activities from Redacted. I'm going to continue here from a separate section. A proposal from one of her foreign policy advisors to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service, end quote. The notes also included a one-line comment which reads thusly, quote, any evidence of collaboration between Trump campaign plus Russia, end quote. Trump's tweet announcing the release, by the way, reads, quote, I have fully authorized the total declassification of any and all documents pertaining to the single greatest political crime in American history, the Russia hoax. Likewise, the Hillary Clinton email scandal, no redactions, end quote. Sadly, I'm seeing plenty of redactions here.
I'm going to give...
Trump administration is asking the Supreme... Go for it, Jamarl.
I was just going to say, I'm going to give Hillary Clinton a nod here. If you are in a political campaign and the only thing that you care about is winning that campaign, would you do it? If you could. And that's the question that you're confronted with. I mean, they're the matter to which they use as they go through their politics are human beings and the perspectives of those human beings. And they use media as almost, let's say, a bludgeon in order to kind of get that perspective out for whatever that is, meaning it can be used for good ends or bad ends. In her case, she's confronted with, am I going to use Trump and Russia? Again, this has foreign policy implications, so it's not just domestic politics, but am I going to use Trump and Russia as a way to try to get in office? The answer was yes. And Brennan, who in his own handwriting is now saying that's Russian disinformation. I'm sorry, it's just, some of this stuff is wild when you really think about, basically they're in a campaign and they decided to do this for their own political ends, something that had massive foreign policy implications. And honestly, when Democrats get in office again, that doesn't stop. Like, it's not like, okay, the election ended and everybody else just kind of forgets what's taking place. No, the implications of that and the people being rabid against Russia because they believe Vladimir Putin toppled democracy itself, those things have lasting repercussions that kind of echo, as they go along. So
you gave Hillary Clinton a nod. I'm going to give her a disapproving shake of the head and a frown. I don't like this, man. I was reading this, for some reason reminds me of Francis Bacon. I was reading some Francis Bacon the other day, 16th, 17th century, I believe 16th century English philosopher, practically the creator of empirical science. Anyway, he made this distinction between wit and wisdom. A wit is relatively cheap, and he sort of contrasted them. It seems like you're praising her for wit when what you should be praising her for is wisdom, not, even though she lacked it in this case. In other words, that might have been a judicious move on her part from purely a political standpoint, but maybe not. But regardless, should she have done that? Was that the wise thing to do as an American citizen and not just as a blindly striving politician?
It depends on what your highest objective
divided and decaying political race.
It depends on what your highest objective
is. That's wisdom, though,
Like there's nothing exists, nothing's real. I mean, what is her highest objective? Get in office. How do I get in office? I'm going to do something really bad, and it is going to have horrific foreign policy implications. And then she still lost. So maybe you're right. Maybe the wisdom wasn't there.
That's the thing. It didn't even work. It didn't even work. It's just yeah, man.
It didn't even work.
That's the real. It didn't even work. All right, you know what? I'm going to go back to the headlines here. The Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to allow counting for the 2020 census to end soon. This comes in an emergency request on Wednesday from Acting Solicitor General Jeffrey Wall. In that request, Wall said that the Census Bureau must immediately wrap up its field operations. The administration's move here comes hours after a federal appeals court rejected its earlier attempt, that's the administration's attempt, to block a lower court order that extended the counting timeline for the 2020 census in order to give the Bureau more time to get an accurate count. Our next headline, France, the U.S., and Russia are holding talks in Geneva today to discuss the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. This comes as fears of a regional war grow. The three countries are members of the OSCE Minsk Group, the diplomatic organization responsible for mediating the conflict between the two countries. French Minister of Foreign Affairs Jean-Yves Le Drian said Russian, French, and U.S. representatives would also meet in Moscow on Monday to look at ways to persuade the warring sides to negotiate a ceasefire. The Armenian Foreign Ministry said Foreign Minister Zarab Natskanyan would visit Moscow on Monday. Azerbaijan's Foreign Minister said Wednesday he will be visiting Switzerland. This comes as Azerbaijan and ethnic Armenian forces fought new clashes in and around the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Azerbaijan said the city of Ganja was shelled by Armenian forces and that one civilian had been killed in the Goranboy region. It said other villages were fired on by ethnic Armenian forces. And the defense ministry of the breakaway Nagorno-Karabakh, itself run by ethnic Armenians, said it had recorded another 30 casualties among its troops, pushing the military death toll there to 350 since fighting with the Azeri forces erupted on September 27th. The fighting has surged to its worst level since the 1990s. Some 30,000 people were killed. We're going to follow this briefly. Turkey's parliament extended a motion to allow the government authority to launch cross-border military operations in Iraq and Syria for one more year. The motion had previously allowed the Turkish armed forces to carry out cross-border operations from October 30th, 2018 until October 30th, 2019. All political parties in Turkey, except the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party, supported the motion at parliament. That motion, by the way, comes ahead of Turkey's planned military operation in the east of the Euphrates in northern Syria. The World Bank has said that due to the coronavirus, up to 150 million people could slip into extreme poverty around the world. That means that they would be living on less than $1.90 a day. This could happen by late next year, depending on how badly economies shrink during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some 82% of the people entering extreme poverty are expected to be in middle-income countries such as India, Nigeria, and Indonesia, the bank said. Many will be more educated urban residents, meaning cities will see an increase in the kind of poverty traditionally rooted in rural areas. Corona is expected to drive a 3.3% contraction in sub-Saharan African economies in 2020 and could push 40 million people into extreme poverty. The Washington-based lender said growth in the region would recover in 2021, but they said that the pandemic has put, quote, a decade of hard-won economic progress at risk. My next headline here, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro said he has ended the country's biggest ever corruption probe, that's Operation Car Wash, due to the fact that, and this is his claim, there's, quote, no more corruption in the government, end quote. I'm going to roll to disbelieve on that one. Launched 6 years ago, the investigation put some of the biggest names in Brazilian politics and this behind bars, including left-wing former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who accused the judiciary of, quote, working to criminalize the left, end quote, after the Supreme Court ordered his release last November. Operation Car Wash, which last month was extended by Brazil's Attorney General until January 31st, upended Brazilian politics and business since it was launched as a money laundering probe. Using an aggressive strategy of arrests and plea bargains, it exposed a massive corruption scheme in which politicians and business executives plundered billions of dollars from state-run oil company Petrobras. Recently, critics have accused the task force of pushing its aggressive tactics too far, provoking twin political and economic crises in the country and undermining suspects' right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. It also faces accusations of playing politics, particularly after leaked communications appeared to show investigators conspiring to keep Lula, a left-wing icon, from staging a comeback in Brazil's 2018 presidential race. Lula, who was the most popular candidate in that race, was barred from contesting the elections that Bolsonaro won. And in our last headline this morning, Hurricane Delta has strengthened back into a Category 2 as it heads for a Friday landfall on the Gulf Coast with storm surge flooding, damaging winds, and rainfall flooding from Louisiana and East Texas to Mississippi. A hurricane warning is in effect from east of Sabine Pass, Texas, to Morgan City, Louisiana. That includes Lake Charles and Lafayette in Louisiana. This means hurricane conditions are expected within 36 hours. And this is also just the most recent in a stream of hurricanes that have battered that Gulf Coast. I pity the people who live there. This is not a good time to live there. Jamarl, I think we should close headlines here. I want to get your take on the news after we do so. However, you've been listening to headlines on Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we're back. Yeah, man. You ever been down Louisiana way, East Texas, that region?
I've been to New Orleans. Well, Louisiana. I'm sorry. God, it was mind slip. I'm sorry. In my head, it was you were mentioning the city. I'm sorry. No, I've never been to Louisiana. No.
I would recommend it. It's beautiful in its own way. I have really fond feelings about New Orleans. I'd recommend checking it out. But if you've driven through there, it's the sense that you get. It's very watery. It is a low-lying region. I said watery. It's a low-lying region, very swampy, a lot of lakes, and a lot of water. And the imagination here is how horrific it must be to have to deal with hurricanes ripping through there constantly during hurricane season. Again, just a brief little disjuncture there, but it just strikes the imagination.
Yeah, I think I've been in maybe one or two hurricanes, and they're terrifying experiences. And so, yes, I would imagine you're right. Not to mention having to rebuild
was that? Real quick,
and that type of stuff. I'm sorry?
Where was that, and what was it like for you? It was only got 30 seconds left.
Believe it or not, that was in Richmond, Virginia.
Wow.
Richmond, Virginia. I was in the hospital of all places, but it hits Richmond and like power, everything shuts down. You have all of these trees and everything else that have been turned over. All of the power in Richmond, the water, all of that stuff was out of commission for like a week or so. They were trying to sell water for higher prices and whatnot. It was just these. Yeah, it was not a great thing. The city looks different. Like as you rode through it, and it was just kind of mangled. So yeah, it's a really weird, bizarre experience. I mean, from where we weren't in danger per se, if that makes sense. Like we were so far away from it that it wasn't a danger thing. But all things being equal, yeah, it was still horrible. And so I would imagine, living in somewhere like Louisiana, New Orleans, Louisiana.
Especially if you need medical treatment, which I'm guessing have historically, from what you've said. If hospitals get shut down, if you can't go out and do that stuff, that quickly becomes life imperiling. Even if you don't get hurt or killed by the storm itself, even if your property is fine, if you can't get around when you need to, that quickly becomes a bad situation. In any event, we've got to go into a break here. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you live from our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, give us a like and share that content. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Do not be shy. Your engagement makes the show what it is. And we still do accept calls, even with the changed format. But joining us, one of my favorite guests, Professor Richard Wolff, Emeritus Professor of Economics at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, visiting professor of international affairs at New School University, New York City graduate program, founder of Democracy at Work, one of my favorite programs, host of Economic Update, and author. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamarl. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, did you get an opportunity to see the debate last night? Which one of these people won, and which one of these people are going to pull us out of the chaos that has surrounded our country at this moment?
Well, it's kind of easy to tell you who for me anyway, is the better choice. But to be really honest with you, I am underwhelmed by the whole choices that were offered, both at the top of the ticket and here at the second position of the ticket. You have to get rid of what we have. It is so abysmal that it really almost doesn't matter, as long as we just stop the craziness that exists now. I just wish that there was a lot more bold proposals for how to deal with our problems from both parties than what we're getting.
Unfortunately, I think what they realize is that if you don't give a proposal and I don't give a proposal, neither one of us have to give a proposal. It's that. It might be. I think it may be as simple as that. Let me ask you the. Okay,
they feed each other into that. That's right.
So yesterday or the other day, Jerome Powell was begging for money. I mean, the hardest working rich man on the planet, screaming and begging for money, at least in the way that he would beg for money. And while he's doing that, Trump is basically saying, I'm done with the negotiations until the election. Now, that's mind-blowing. The Democrats is trying to give him, $2.4 trillion. He wants 1.6. And even though he was perfectly willing to give his oligarchs trillions, when it comes to the American public, that less than $1 trillion was just too much. It was too much. What is this country going to look like?
It is.
At the election point. I mean, if we get to November, what does this country look like?
That's right. And I'm afraid I have to say again, which follows our earlier conversation, that both the Democratic offer and the Republican smaller counter offer are inadequate to deal with the problems that we have. I mean, this is bizarre. We are in the second worst depression in the history of the capitalist system that's 3 centuries old. The only thing worse than what we're in now was 1930s. And we don't know how long we're going to be in this one. And it may end up getting to be in the dubious honor of the number 1 worst period of time. You have to massively confront this kind of thing, or else you're not going to solve it. And we have a daily example. You needed a massive confrontation with this virus to beat it, but you didn't do it. You're still not doing it. And as a result, the United States, here's the fundamental statistic that everybody has to think about. The United States has 4.5% of the world's population, and we have 25% of the world's COVID cases and the world's COVID deaths. We are a rich country with a well-developed medical system. This is a level of failure that blows your mind. And you ought to get the lesson. Wow, we didn't go all out mobilizing our public resources, our private resources to deal with this virus, and look at the price we're paying. But you're not learning the lesson, because if you did, you would be mobilizing everything to deal with the economic crisis we have in the same way. But you're not doing it. You're fighting over minor disagreements in terms of the amount of money needed to really deal with this problem. It's amazing to watch. It's like watching a train roaring down a track, heading for a brick wall. Everybody sees it. The people on the train, the people looking at the train, we see the wall, we see the rushing train, we see the disaster coming, but we're like the famous deer in the headlights. No one's doing anything.
What's weird to me is how slow motion, how slow that train wreck appears to be coming. I mean, I agree with you, but it seems like we've done quite a bit of stuff to stave that catastrophe off. We'll see where it goes in the future. Obviously, unemployment numbers have been up. People have been getting their jobs back, though. I guess fundamentally, what lesson, you said that we're not learning the lesson that you think we would need to learn. What lesson do you think we need to learn in order to effectively deal with this catastrophe as well as the other catastrophes that are concomitant with it? Professor Wolff.
Good. I know. I'm glad you asked. I think the lesson is that you have to be honest and recognize the depth of the problem you're in. It's kind of a precondition for solving it. If I can borrow from another tradition, the most effective anti-alcoholism program in the United States has for a long time been AA. And if you've ever heard or known or gone to an AA meeting, you'll know that one of the things that's required, a little mini ritual, is that before you speak, you introduce yourself and you say a sentence more or less like, I am an alcoholic. And the purpose of that is to put front and forward what you share with the other people in that room. You have a problem, and you're not dancing around it or denying it or pretending it's small. It's a big deal. That's why you're there, to get over it. And for me, that's what you have to face. We are in a very, very bad position. This is the third economic crisis in the young new century we're living in. We had the dot-com in 2000, the subprime mortgage in 2008, and now the COVID-19. I mean, it's extraordinary, but each one is worse than the one before. We have to face what such an unstable economic system threatens us with. And one of the things it threatens us with is if it happened together with another kind of crisis, for example, a pandemic virus, well, then the combination could, and I mean this seriously, overwhelm us as a society, literally tear us apart. And there's more than enough evidence to suggest that the Trump administration, the Black Lives Matter, the Proud Boys, I mean, the signs of our society tearing itself apart should be enough that you've got to go to the basics. So let me give you an example. Over the last 6 months, we required as a society more than 50 million people to go to an unemployment office and make a claim and get unemployment benefits. Some of them, millions, are still on them. Others were able to get back into some kind of a job, although in most cases, one that had poorer qualities of wages and benefits than when they left it in February or March of this year. Okay, that's crazy. All of those 50 million people who were unemployed, and those that continue to be, they continue to eat, they continue to wear clothing, they continue to use up the resources of this society, they live in homes, or at least many of them do. In other words, they're consuming, but our society doesn't have them producing. They want a job, they need the income. And we need the economy to be thriving with the produce that they could have produced. But we as a society did not take the steps necessary to put the people who want the job together with the capacity to produce, which we have, to produce the output with which we could rebuild our cities, overcome our racial horror show of inequality, etc. We didn't do any of it. We sit there scratching our noses, wondering why the society seems to be falling apart. But it's because we will not face that the level of problem we have is deep enough that we really need to take some strong action to change this system so it copes better with the problems it faces.
Professor, I always like the way you frame this. You frame it around rationality. And you don't say I'm framing it around rationality, but that's the way it's framed. Now, rationality is always tethered to something, but you don't really need to tether part because people kind of get it. When you kind of frame it in a particular way, it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. And it does make sense. Why, I guess the question, and I guess this is going to be a leading question, and we can close it out early and I can bring you back in. But why? Now, and what I mean is why from Shane's original point, where it's like, this is basically, all of these people have gotten ill. All of these people are out of a job. You have all of this money, and from the standpoint of a rich society to be able to deal with this, clearly, because other countries with less resources were able to deal with it. Cuba, for God's sake, is sending doctors out around the world. You know what I mean? So why would an affluent society with all of the resources in the way that it has allow something like this to take place upon the population? 200,000 of its own people dead. And on to piggyback on that, this notion of hegemony. And I want to get into a question on Gramsci when we get back. But I think the fundamental question is why? Why does a population allow it? And why would a government in and of itself do it? You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Thomas Stranahan. We're joined by Professor Richard Wolff, Emeritus Professor of Economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst, Visiting Professor of International Affairs at New School University, New York City Graduate Program, and founder of Democracy at Work, host of Economic Update, and author. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan. We are also joined by Professor Richard Wolff, Emeritus Professor of Economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst, Visiting Professor of International Affairs at New School University, New York City Graduate Program, that for some reason trips me up, founder of Democracy at Work, host of Economic Update, and author. So let's get into a conversation on Gramsci and this notion of hegemony. Why would a country of 300 million accept what has befallen it with all of the resources at its disposal, where it knows the resources are at its disposal, where it is seen the government give trillions to millionaires and billionaires? Why does a country accept it? And I'm asking this in the context of this kind of hegemonic notion of we get stuck in our ways. Could you explain that, or at the very least talk about that?
Absolutely, I'd love to. First of all, I appreciate your reminding us all of the absolutely stunning work of the Italian thinker and writer and political leader Antonio Gramsci. If listeners to this program were to be inspired to go get some of his writings and read them, that alone would make this an especially valuable program, because this is work that needs to be read over and over again. He was a union leader. He was a political leader in Italy. He led the general strike in the northern city of Torino as a leader of the workers working in the Fiat automobile. Torino at that time was the automobile center of Italy, the way Detroit was the automobile center of the United States. And he came to fame in Italy because of his leadership of that general strike, went on to become the leader of the Italian Communist Party. He was arrested by the fascist leader Mussolini and spent the last 12 or 15 years of his life in prison where he was effectively maltreated and not given medical care, and then died. So he was, in a sense, a martyr of progressive politics in Italy. And he asked himself this question. He said, and it's the same question we need to ask now. He said that if you look at the employer class in Italy, what number of people are we talking about? And he did the work. He was a very scrupulous researcher. And he came to the same conclusion that we would come to today if we asked the same question. What's the percentage of people in our society who are employers? And the answer is 2 to 3%. And that was the answer in Italy at the time he wrote. And that's the answer today, both in Italy, the United States, and most other capitalist countries. The overwhelming majority of people in modern capitalist societies are employees. Okay, well, now you got a problem. Why? The economic realm of life, the businesses, the factories, the offices, the stores, the things that produce goods and services, are owned and operated by that minority, those 3%, the employers. And they make all the decisions, what to produce, what technology to use, where to carry out production, and what to do with all the work, the output that everybody's labor has combined to produce. All those decisions are made by a tiny number of people. The problem is the majority are excluded from those decisions. The employees have nothing to say. They have no control. The people at the top are not accountable to the employees for the decisions they make. Okay, so Gramsci said those 2-3% at the top, they know how vulnerable their situation is. They're surrounded by a vast majority of people who want more wages than they're being paid, who want a better standard of living than the one they're enjoying, who'd like some control over their job and their life of the sort they are excluded from. And so the minority have got to do something. Here comes Gramsci's insight. They're such a small minority that they're at risk of being overwhelmed, that the majority will elect the politicians who will serve the majority at the expense of the minority of employers, and they don't want that, to say the least. So they have to find ways to be dominant in the society, even though they're a small minority. And he called the dominance that the minority of employers have to create and sustain hegemony. They have to be dominant, and they have to figure out ways to find at least some people in the working class that they can reach by being in favor of some issue that they care about. So, for example, Mr. Trump, who once was a big advocate of abortion, is now an opponent of abortion. Why? Because that way he can build an alliance with certain fundamentalist religious groups that we know of, who will then support Mr. Trump in taking care of the employer class because he gives them something in the way of a position on abortion. Or if you love to carry guns in the back of your pickup truck, okay, then he'll come out for that. He has to put together a tough coalition of very different groups for whom he can do something so he gets them to support the dominance of the employer class. And what Gramsci's genius was, he showed how that was done in Italy. And if you read him, you can figure out how it is being done today here in the United States. And it will help you explain why millions of people will vote for a president. They did it in 2016, and they will be doing it again next month. Will vote for someone who economically undercuts them. But they have been cleverly put together in an alliance where they're focused on something else. And the hope is they'll be so entranced by his position, I don't know, on guns or on abortion or bashing China, whatever it is that he figures out to weld this disparate groups together. They hope they'll get enough of them so that they can continue to serve the employer class which is the fundamental thing they did. Don't forget, the first basic major achievement of the Trump administration after he won the election in 2016 was to produce the biggest tax cut for corporations and the wealthy in American history, which it was. And it came at the end of a period when the rich had gotten richer. And Mr. Trump boasted about what he had done because it was his delivery to the number one group he has to keep happy. And that's why we've had a rising stock market, even though the main street economy of this society is in such tough shape.
Professor Wolff, thank you. That was a great introduction, a great overview. I want to step away from Gramsci for just a second in the attempt to cut a little bit closer to the quick from another direction. Okay. Going back to a slightly earlier Italian thinker, in this case, Alfredo Pareto. So Mandelbrot, Benoit Mandelbrot, the creator of the Mandelbrot set, I'm going to read his sort of summary here. He's talking about Pareto's writing and work. Right. According to Pareto, society was not a, quote, social pyramid, end quote, with a proportion of rich to poor sloping gently from one class to the next. Instead, it was more of a social arrow, very fat on the bottom where the mass of men live, and very thin at the top where sit the wealthy elite, end quote. Pareto was describing a capitalist society. But that quote, as far as I can tell, can also be leveled, that indictment can also be leveled against basically all preceding forms of civilized humanity, all whether it's feudalism, whether it's the Roman Empire. If you're looking at various political forms, those seem endemic simply to human political organization. So, according to Gramsci, and according to you, and potentially according to Marx too, wherever you want to take this, what is the means of escape if we're going to indict that system, yet we live within it? The hope there is that we can come to another system that replaces it. But specifically, I'm curious, how do we do that? What's the process by which we can escape that fat arrow and maybe level it out from an arrow to a pyramid to maybe just as a gently sloping curve of some sort? I don't know exactly where you'd want to take this, but Dr. Wolff, Professor Wolff, please take it away.
All right, so you have thrown me the pitch. Let me try to hit the thing with my bat here, okay? And I'm going to give you the answer Karl Marx gave. I can't do better than that, and that would be one for us all to chew on. Here's Marx's argument. Human history reflects or shows us pretty much what you just said, a sequence over the last, 2,000, maybe 3,000 years, maybe even a bit more, of societies that were organized in terms of how they organized production into a two-role kind of game. In slavery, the roles were either master or slave. Everybody was one or the other. The masters made all the decisions, the slaves did all the work. We then had feudalism. And even though there were many differences, for example, one person couldn't be the property of another, feudalism did show a certain similarity because it divided everybody either into a lord or a serf. The lords had all the power and the wealth, and the serfs did all the work. All right, now comes capitalism. It's different from slavery. No, we don't allow people to be owned. It's different from serfs and lords. People are not stuck on the land that they were born on the way serfs were, etc. We have a contract. I will work for you, you pay me. But guess what? Capitalism, too, has this terrible similarity to slavery and feudalism because it divides everybody into one of two classes. You're either the employer or you are the employee. And again, the employers are sitting in the pretty space. They have the wealth, they have the power, and the employees do the work. So that's similar. But, says Marx, and here comes the genius, that's not all human history. There are examples before slavery and since slavery of societies that refuse to divide people into these two positions. If you look at the Iroquois among Native Americans, if you look at ancient tribes in the Middle East, Asia, Europe, if you look at communities that withdrew from slavery or feudalism or capitalism precisely to set up villages or towns or whole regions where they didn't organize things like that. Out of that, Marx says, wait a minute. Could we, on the basis of modern technology and all the achievements that capitalism, feudalism, and slavery made, because they were complicated systems that achieved things as well as did horrors. Can we learn from them? And his answer was yes. What we ought to do is reorganize our economic system to get rid of this minority that makes all the decisions and imposes them on the majority. We have to go beyond slavery, no more master slave, beyond feudalism, no more lord serf, but also beyond capitalism, no more employer employee. And therefore, punchline, you have to reorganize business so that it becomes democratic, that the way you run your business is the way we think democracy ought to be everywhere. In the community where you live, we don't want leaders unless we, the people, have some power over the leader. The reason we make votes for mayor or governor or president are because we, who get to have to live with the decisions these political leaders make, want some power over them. And yet when we cross the threshold into our job, into our factory or office or store, we give up on our democracy. We allow the people there at the top, the owner, the board of directors, to tell us what to do and how to do and where to do it. And at the end of the day, we go home at 5 o'clock. And what we help to produce using our brains and our muscles belongs to the employer, that tiny group of people who then decide what to do with it. In my judgment, that's where we have to. We have to make that basic change if we are going to solve the problems that we have kicked down the road for so long that they're now crashing in on us. And that means we have to face that the big problems we have require the bigger and bolder solutions.
Professor Wolff, we may have different opinions, different beliefs, different prognostications on what's going to follow capitalism, but I think we both agree fundamentally that there is a change coming, the wind is blowing.
Absolutely.
And I'm very curious to see what's on the other side. Professor Wolff, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, and thank you for posing the kinds of questions that really need to be discussed. It's a real virtue of your program.
I think you struck it out of the park, by the way. Professor Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs. That's at the New School University in New York City. He is the founder of Democracy at Work and the host of their nationally syndicated show, Economic Update. And by the way, his latest book is The System is the Sickness, and Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be back in 1 minute.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. This is an open segment. We usually are having a conversation during this segment, and we're gonna, but if you want to join that conversation, I would recommend that you do so now. Our phone number, by the way, to join that convo is 202-521-1320. I see we already have a caller. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. And again, if you want to join, 202-521-1320. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah, I want to talk about some names that's part of the Russian gate thing that the people that was involved with it. Before I get into it, I think Trump and them need to look into a bank holiday, something like a Glass-Steagall, to protect homeowners, business owners in general, people from losing their cars, people from losing their houses, getting kicked out of their apartments. Something that can hold up, to put their mortgages back on the end for 6 months. Something that can suspend people on rent for mortgages or whatever loans for like 6 months, right? That would solve a lot of things, stop these evictions and people being kicked out the small businesses and business in general. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. Okay, these are names I'm going to go over, which your father went over throughout the years. Andrea Alexander Chalupa, she worked with the DNC. She was part of it. Brett Kimmerlin. I'm not hearing his name brought up among these people talking about Russiagate. He worked
brought him up briefly earlier, but yeah, he's lesser known. Sorry for interrupting, Tariq, but yeah, go back into it.
Okay, Brett Kimmerlin, Corda Shear, Stroll Tarver, Sidney Brumenthal. I'm not hearing his name that much. Victoria Newland, George Soros, Bill Browder, and Mikhail Kananatsky. These are the 9 people. They have more people than that that's involved with the Russiagate. They trying to set up these people.
Real quick, I believe that the last name you threw in there, that was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
Tarif. Great call,
yes.
Man. As per usual, I really appreciate that. That is a good list of names to start with, definitely. And I think if you start doing searches on those names, you're going to find there's a lot lying beneath the tip of that iceberg. There's a lot more to uncover. We covered Bill Browder frequently on this show. I think we can do more and should do more soon to talk about Khodorkovsky as well. We also, I think we briefly brought up Victoria Nuland. I think Lee briefly brought up Victoria Nuland during the call earlier. But yes, she, Strobe Talbot, State Department lackeys, who played a key role. We were talking earlier about NABU in Ukraine, the Anti-Corruption Bureau in Ukraine. The FBI has an office there. And the assumption here is that along with NABU, along with the post-revolution Ukrainian government aligned with the West, there was a great degree of coordination in terms of, pushing back against Trump. And like Lee said earlier, fundamentally, we overthrew a government. We put our puppet government in their stead. And then we've used that government to try to discredit the current president back in 2016. So this stuff is shocking. The Tarif, thank you for the call. By the way, again, we are taking calls. 202-521-1320. That's the number you should call if you want to join our conversation. We have D from California on the line. D, what's going on?
Hey, guys. Traveling in California was to get away from the air quality in the area.
D, we cannot hear you. I don't know. It sounds like you have a pretty terrible reception. I heard something about air quality in California. Let's give this one more try. Maybe get near a window or something like that. What were you saying?
Sorry. The connection, there's some connection issues going on, but I mentioned something. Did you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you better now. Please keep going.
Yeah, so I was asking a young lady yesterday evening about the debates or just about the primary in general, what she thought of it or about her engagement. A younger person, and although I think messaging is really important, and you guys have gone over a lot of what Sanders' campaign could have done differently and better. I agree with most of that. And I wanted to just kind of drop this point of messaging again that I would bring up. Hopefully get a chance to call in the future more. And that not me, us, I thought was a bad one. I agree with it on the whole, but just as a message, like as a campaign slogan. And mostly I didn't watch the debate. I haven't heard all of your show today, so I didn't catch much. Or maybe I caught a little of what was said about it, but I'm trying to soak in October baseball now, and I think a lot of people, like the young lady, who would have been more engaged if there was maybe better messaging.
I can't help but agree. I think that but both sides avoided policy. I believe that actually Jamarl and Richard Wolff briefly had this conversation in the first segment of that interview. They both avoided policy, and it's almost as if there's a tacit agreement not to talk about policy, because if they get into policy, a lot of people's heads are going to start to spin. D, thank you from the call. Appreciate it. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah. I think you get to the point in campaigns. I don't think it started off that way. I think it degraded that way. Meaning when you realize, hey, we can get away without any accountability just by saying blue no matter who. Let's do that. And especially when what you're getting paid for is at cross purposes with your party. Meaning you have to find some mechanism of control in order to keep control of the elements of your party that completely and fundamentally disagree with what you push. If the Republicans get to the point where they're just using, you have clearly a wealthier class of people paying and pushing these guys, but also you find hooks into other special interests. Then Democrats get to the point of maybe saying themselves, hey, we're getting paid fantastic amounts of cash also. And our base entirely hates this. So what is our political gimmick? Oh, I know, least worst. Least worst. And so you get up on the campaign stage, you say that guy's an ogre, he said you're an ogre, and you bash each other over the heads. And you go back to your two teams. Debate over. I mean, it's fundamentally unproductive in regards to what the public needs or wants. And it even, honestly, it's gotten to the point where it seems like the public is an afterthought.
It's true. This also comes, by the way, this is posted. Thank you for your work, Raheem, here. Commission on Presidential Debates said on Thursday that the next debate between President Trump and Joe Biden would be held virtually because of health concerns about the coronavirus. But Mr. Trump, who tested positive last week for COVID, immediately objected to that concept in a television interview, saying, quote, "I'm not going to waste my time on a virtual debate. That's not what debating is all about. You sit behind a computer and do a debate. It's ridiculous," end quote. Now, I'm not going to take that too personally. We sit behind our computers and do a debate pretty much every morning. I think that once we get back into the studio, though, the gloves will really come off. And that's the segue, in some sense, into what I wish had happened in this last debate. Hopefully, if they do it in person, in this next debate, what happens is, at some point, Trump and Biden just lose control. They jump over the podiums. Trump is wielding like some kind of a lead mask or something. Biden has a chain, maybe the same chain he was using against Corn Pop back in the day, and they just start wailing on each other. And then at the end of it, maybe they hug it out a little bit. And I just think that would be a historic moment. That would also be the kind of wrestling spectacular extravaganza that I think we've come to expect from our political system. Again, not to beat this dead horse, but there are far more circuses than bread at this point. It all seems to be entertainment, not enough moral, spiritual, or even physical sustenance. I don't know, Jamarl, what's your take?
Listen, the empire is collapsing, but at least it's going to be a good show. Right? If I'm not mistaken, Trump did get into the wrestling ring at one point. I could be wrong, but if I remember that, I have a distinct memory of that, of seeing him in the wrestling ring at one point. I mean, why not? He's a showman. And so he I wouldn't be shocked by that. Yeah, it's a travesty. I mean, like I said, I love the way Richard Wolff frames his arguments. It's in this way of what's rational. Now, again, rationality is always tethered to something, and he tethers it to this notion of human health, human development, human happiness. And somebody else can take a different tact, but at the very least, that's where he's sticking his stake in the ground, and he wants you to be there with him. Yeah, it's weird. It's strange. Our country is hit by multiple crises. I mean, let's be very clear here. Nothing has changed. People are still dying, nearly 1,000 a day, last I checked. And you still have the situation where they're expecting, 300,000 dead by Christmas? Meaning it's still ticking along. And the number of people who are out of a job is still ticking along. And the fires in California are still ticking along. And the evictions are still ticking along. Nothing has changed. And these people are up there supposedly, in a contest that people are supposed to choose who's going to fix this, who's going to address this, who's going to do something about this. And it seems that Biden is thinking, hey, I'm just going to feel my way to it. Just by the sheer force of my will, I'm going to bring it back to status quo. Which, by the way, it was the status quo government that got thrown out for being status quo and being underwhelming with a paucity of ideas that in no way addresses any of this stuff. There is no political solution to this problem.
That's not going to happen.
No, it's not.
Trump is not the disease. Trump is the symptom.
Exactly.
And I mean, we talk smack about Trump every day. We talk smack about Biden every day. But yeah, if you're going to try to make America normal again, which seems to be the Biden agenda, then I think you'd have to do some fundamental stuff to make changes. Frankly, though, nothing we do can make America normal again. And arguably, if we're going to make America great again, it's going to be in some radically different form. I think we're starting to see the beginnings of that push, of what that, not what that form might look like, but at least of the conditions that are going to sort of set the tone, set the context, set the setting for the development of that system. I don't know, though. That's a big conversation.
Yeah, it's just so far away. That's the depressing part. Like if
might be.
Whatever that something else was going to be, whatever that world thing, because I don't think it's an American thing, it's a world thing. At this point, with a connected world like this, I don't think you get there just purely from the standpoint of one government.
Oh God, no. But we are still, in some sense, the chief government in terms of who people are looking to, not to resolve diplomatic disputes, not that thing, but just in terms of our outsized importance, the size of our military, all that stuff. What happens here? I'm not going to say it's going to spread immediately abroad, but if we see some changes, and it's not going to be a utopia. Hopefully, it won't be a dystopia. It's going to be some mixed bag. It's just we're in a critical moment where change is coming. I think we need to get a handle on that change, and hopefully, you say it's not going to happen for a while. I think it's happening right now, honestly. Anyway, we've got to call it quits for today. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. That's my co-host and myself on Fault Lines. Thank you to engineer Andre. Thank you to producers Cam and Raheem. Thank you to all of our guests. And lastly, thank you for listening. We will be back tomorrow. Again, we're taking this coming Monday off. It's a federal holiday. Until tomorrow, though, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining me. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. It was another great show with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. I am going to be back later to do the news. But first, let me just make sure. Yeah, it was a good show today. Dynamic, interesting. We wanted to hit some of the elements of the stuff that was dropped yesterday. One of the things I wanted to get into was the John Durham investigation, and we didn't get an opportunity to do it. And there was also another question with Richard Wolff. How do you grapple with China from the perspective of like a Marxist? Man, I wanted to get that answer from him. Linda Lee Yu 123. Do you think that the fly on Pence's head was a photon? Was photoshopped like Tulsi's? Zit. It didn't move. Interesting. I don't think so. I mean, that would be weird to do that in the moment. I don't think that was in the moment. So fair enough, Linda Lee. Nice being cynical, but a little too cynical. Comments on Trump's versus stimulus bill. I think this was yesterday. Was it? Yeah, I think this was yesterday. And I think I answered this yesterday. Look, the Trump stimulus bill 1.6 versus Democrats 2.2. After you've given one of the largest tax cut in American history to oligarchs, how do you turn around and tell the American public they're not worth an extra trillion? It's obscene, to put it mildly. And to push this to the end of the election, well, you heard Professor Wolff. That misery is going to spread, and that misery is going to get deep, and those people who are basically furloughed workers are going to become more permanent, and it's going to cascade. You have less money to inject into your system, less money those businesses can function, less businesses that end up functioning, and end up more businesses that end up going belly up. Yeah, it's a cascading issue. I'm going to end this here, though. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you guys a little bit later.